I knew the snowman was wrong before I even opened the door, because the frost on my living room window kept fogging in little pulses, like someone outside was breathing against the glass. I told myself it was warm air leaking or the storm doing something weird, until I slid the curtain aside and saw the snowman staring straight at me. An hour earlier, he'd been a goofy thing. The neighborhood kids helped me build coal eyes, pebble smile, my wife's red scarf, planted by the mailbox facing the street. Now he was turned toward my house, perfectly square, like he'd chosen my window. Outside the blizzard was the kind that erases things. As you watch streetlights swallowed sound, muffled the whole block, reduced to drifting white. That should have meant safety. Nobody was out there. Nobody could be out there for long. But there were no footprints leading to the snowman's new spot. No churned paths, no scuffs. Just a smooth, wind-swept yard like fresh paint. I watched for a full minute, trying to catch the trick. Maybe the storm was pushing him, maybe the base had slumped and I was overreacting. I went to wake my wife Erin, and she mumbled, "It's late," and rolled over. I didn't blame her. The snowman moved, is what paranoid people say. So I did what idiots do when they need to prove they're not idiots. I went to the front door. The moment I cracked it open, the cold punched me. Snow hissed across the porch boards. The porch light threw a weak yellow cone into the storm, and in that light, the snowman's face looked wrong up close, too tidy, too intentional. The coal eyes weren't matte. They glistened. The longer I stared, the more my brain started doing that ugly math it does when something is almost human but not quite like a store mannequin that seems to track you from the corner of your eye. I kept wanting to look away, and I kept forcing myself not to because I was suddenly afraid of what might happen in the seconds I wasn't watching. The pebble mouth looked tighter than I remembered, like it was holding something in. The dog stood behind me and refused to cross the threshold, growling low nails, scraping the wood like he wanted distance, more than he wanted to protect me. "Hey!" I shouted, into the wind. "Knock it off." Nothing answered until the glass beside the door fogged again, right at face height from the outside. I froze with my hand still on the knob. I counted. 1, 2, 3. The fog bloomed again, a little higher. This time as if whoever was out there had shifted their weight to breathe quietly. My brain tried to build a safe story. Humidity, temperature, my own breath, anything. But the dog's growl deepened into a snarl, and that snarl told me he smelled something my panic hadn't processed. Yet sweat under snow, skin under a costume. I shut the door and locked it so hard, the deadbolt clicked twice. I grabbed the fireplace poker with one hand, and my phone with the other, and my fingers shook so badly I hit the wrong buttons. When I finally got 911, I heard my own voice sounding calm, in a way that terrified me more than the cold did. "There's someone outside my house," I said. "I think they're hiding inside a snowman." The dispatcher paused just long enough to decide if I was joking. Then the dog barked, sharp, panicked, and the glass rattled like something had bumped it from the other side. The dispatcher's tone changed immediately. "Sir, get away from the door. Stay inside. Officers are on the way." Erin appeared in the hallway, hair a mess, eyes wide. "What's going on, bathroom?" I said. "Shoes. Lock it." And then the snowman moved again. Not a tilt, not a slump. He advanced. One slow, heavy step that compressed snow with weight. The base slid forward, and the head stayed level, and for a split second, the neighbor's Christmas lights caught a seam under the scarf. An unnatural shadow, a gap where packed snow didn't meet right, a gap big enough for air. The snowman stopped at the bottom of my porch steps and stood there inches from the first step like it was waiting for me to come outside and fix something. The worst part wasn't how close he was. The worst part was how ordinary the disguise was. That's what made it work. Nobody expects the snowman. Nobody takes a snowman seriously. You laugh at him in daylight, and you stop looking closely at night. You assume your fear is childish, and you correct yourself into danger. I kept the phone pressed to my ear, whispering answers to the dispatcher, while I watched the snowman watch my house. The carrot nose shifted slightly, and a thin flash of metal winked behind it. Just a sliver of reflection, and my stomach dropped because I understood the plan. Get me outside, get me close, let me lean in to straighten the scarf, and then a sharp, Tap sounded against the front window. Not loud. Not enough to break it. Just enough to make Erin gasp behind me. The snowman's head angled toward the movement inside. Red and blue light suddenly washed across the yard, turning the storm purple. Tires crunched. Doors slammed. "Police," a voice shouted. "Show your hands." The snowman went perfectly still. Of course it did. An officer climbed the porch steps and raised his flashlight, sweeping the yard. Another came in from the side boots, punching the first real footprints into the smooth snow. He circled behind the snowman and kicked hard. The snowman collapsed like a cheap prop. Snow slid off in slabs, revealing wire mesh and PVC shaped into a hollow shell. Inside was a man in white coveralls, curled tight face, raw with cold eyes, furious and bright. The scarf was tied around the frame, not a neck. The mittens were zip-tied to rods. The carrot was orange plastic, jammed over a breathing hole, and in his gloved hand there was a knife. He tried to lunge and got tangled in his own disguise. The officers yanked him out and pinned him in the snow, while he thrashed and screamed like being seen had hurt him. When they dragged him toward the squad car, I caught the smell of him through the open door, sweat cigarettes, something sour and old, like a place that hasn't had sunlight in a long time. Later, one officer told me they'd found cigarette butts and a duffel bag behind my shed. Duct tape, zip ties, gloves, the kind of prank gear nobody buys for laughs. Another officer asked if we'd noticed anything missing, any strange cars any time our dog barked at nothing. I stared at my own front yard, like it had been complicit. By the time the police lights faded, the storm had already started erasing everything again, smoothing the churned snow, swallowing the footprints, pretending nothing had happened. The broken snowman looked harmless once more, just a collapsed pile of white under a red scarf. That's what stays with me. Not the knife, not the shouting, not even the man's face. It's how quickly evil can crawl back into ordinary shapes, how a joke you make with kids can become a hiding place by midnight, and how for a few minutes in that blizzard there was someone in my yard pretending not to be alive, breathing, softly against my window, waiting for me to open the door. Há dois chapters presencial. M. I was staring through my kitchen window at a snowman that should have been across the street, and I was thinking one clear, stupid thought: don't blink. The storm outside turned the world into a white blur, but the snowman's face was sharp in my porch light, two black eyes that looked wet, a pebble grin that suddenly felt too neat. Every time I looked away, even for a heartbeat, it got closer. Earlier that evening, the kids on our block built it, in the empty lot opposite my house. I watched from the doorway while they argued over the carrot nose, then finally planted it under the streetlight like a winter joke. My wife was working a late shift at the hospital, so it was just me and the usual house noises, pipes, settling the fridge, clicking wind, worrying the siding. Around 1:00, I looked up and saw the snowman exactly where it should be. I remember feeling relieved for no reason at all, the way you feel when you check the door and it's locked. At 1, 2, 3, the snowman was turned. Not toppled. Not melted. Turned as if it had rotated to face my house. I told myself it was wind. Then I noticed the yard. Smooth. Unbroken. No footprints leading to it. None leaving. The storm was falling, yes, but not fast enough to erase a person walking across open snow that cleanly. At 1:40, it wasn't under the streetlight anymore. It was near the curb by the stop sign, closer by a distance my brain refused to accept. I turned on my porch light and stared until my eyes burned. I'd never had a name for it, but I felt that uncanny mannequin store panic. Something almost human, almost alive, that shouldn't be either. I forced myself not to look away. I blinked. When my eyes opened, it was at the edge of my driveway. I stepped back hard enough to bump the counter. I looked for a safe explanation. Perspective shadows drifting snow, but reference points don't lie. The snowman's arm was lined up with my neighbor's trash can now. It hadn't been. I grabbed my phone and started recording through the glass, because recording is what you do when fear feels embarrassing. I held the camera steady on the snowman for 30 straight seconds. Nothing moved. It just stood there, collecting fresh snow on its shoulders, looking harmless. A gust rattled the window. I flinched and glanced down to keep the phone from slipping. When I looked up, the snowman was in my front yard, halfway to my porch steps. Still no tracks. Still no drag marks. Just the snowman, closer, as if the storm itself had carried it politely forward. I turned on every light in the house. It didn't help. It only added my reflection over the glass, making it feel like there were two of me watching, both equally useless. I considered calling the police, and stopped hearing the skepticism before it happened. So I did the next worst thing. I tried to test it. I even cracked the front door with the chain still on, just enough to let the cold spill in and let me aim my phone flashlight across the porch. The snowman didn't sway in the wind like a loose pile should. It held its shape with stubborn control. The scarf wasn't fluttering so much as barely twitching, like something underneath was keeping it from moving too much. I shut the door again and realized my hands were shaking so hard I could hear my keys jingling. I put a strip of tape on the inside of the window, at the height of the snowman's eyes. If it moved, I'd know. Then I stared at the tape and the coal eyes behind it, forcing my body to stay still. My eyes watered. I blinked. The eyes were above the tape now. A soft tapping started on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. Not a branch. Not hail. Something small and intentional like a fingernail. I backed away into the hallway. From there I could still see the porch through the doorway, still see the snowman's pale shape and black face. The tapping stopped. Minutes passed. My breathing slowed just enough for hope to show up fragile and stupid. My phone buzzed with a text from my wife. Long night. You okay? My eyes dropped to read it. I reflex. Less than a second. When I looked back up, the snowman was on my porch. Its face was inches from the glass, close enough that the coal eyes didn't look like coal anymore. They looked like holes cut into something that wanted to look human. Behind them, something shifted subtle, as a shadow under ice. I called 911 before my brain could argue me into silence. "There's someone on my porch," I said. "They're inside a snowman. Please." The dispatcher kept me talking while officers came. I stood in the hallway holding the phone with both hands, staring at a shape that didn't belong there. The porch light made it look almost friendly, like something a child would hug, and that contrast made my stomach churn. Red and blue lights finally spilled across the snow, turning the storm purple. Officers approached with flashlights up. The snowman didn't move. For one horrifying moment I thought they'd ignore it, and the disguise would work. Then an officer stopped, aimed his light at the face, and said, "That's not coal." He jabbed the snowman's side with his flashlight. The shell gave with a hollow crunch. Snow collapsed, and a person spilled out white coveralls, hood gloves so cold their movements looked stiff, like a puppet with frozen joints. They tried to scramble up, but the officers were already on them, pinning them on the porch boards. As they cuffed the intruder, the hood shifted, and I saw what the snowman head really was. A cheap, pale mannequin mask, under packed snow, with the eye holes cut out. The pebble grin had been pressed into place like makeup. The whole thing was designed for one purpose, to stand still long enough that a normal person would stop looking closely. Later they told me the intruder had a small knife in a pocket, and a backpack hidden under the porch. Steps, duct tape, zip ties, hand warmers, a phone with my street pulled up on a map. The officers said the storm was the accomplice. In heavy snow, a person can crawl low and erase their own trail with their knees and elbows, keeping all the deep prints in one place of the snowman's base, so it looks like nothing ever walked up. Hearing that didn't comfort me. It only meant the magic had been planning and patience. After they led the intruder away, an officer asked me quietly, "How many times did you look away?" I didn't answer, because the truth made me feel sick. I looked away every time my body did what bodies do. Blink, flinch, check a phone, breathe. And every time it got closer. By morning, the storm had smoothed the yard clean again. The porch boards were dusted white. The tracks were gone. If you hadn't known, you wouldn't have known. What I did know was this: the tape I'd put on the window was still there, and right above it, a faint smear remained in the frost like a mouth had been pressed close enough to warm the glass. The snowman was gone. The porch was empty, but the window still looked breathed on. I stood at the window and watched the empty lot across the street, like it was watching back. Even now, when I walk past mannequins in a store or statues in a park, I catch myself holding my stare a little too long, refusing to blink, because part of me still believes that the second my eyes close, something harmless will take one quiet. Step forward. Sometimes I'll catch my own reflection in a dark window and feel that old reflex, eyes wide, breath held, as if the safest thing in the world is simply to keep looking. It's ridiculous. I know it is. But my body learned a rule that night. Blinking is how distance disappears. The mannequin was standing in my bedroom doorway when I woke up, dressed in my coat and scarf, head tilted like it had been watching me sleep. For one frozen second, I thought it was a person wearing a plastic face, because the streetlight through the blinds striped its features and made the empty eye sockets look wet. I reached for my phone, without looking away. The screen lit the room and the thing did not blink, did not sway, did not breathe. That should have been a relief, but it was worse, because mannequins are what you get when you remove the life from a person and leave the outline behind. I slid out of bed and grabbed the heavy lamp base with both hands. When I swung and hit its shoulder, it made a hard, hollow crack like striking a drum. It rocked and returned to center. I shoved it, and it toppled into the hall with a clatter that woke my dog. My coat fell open, and in that flash, I saw something under the plastic chest that did not belong. A pale sleeve fabric, and a strip of real skin, where there should have been molded fiberglass. I backed up so fast I nearly fell, slammed my bedroom door, and locked it. My hands shook so badly, I mistyped the passcode on my phone twice before I got through to 911. When the dispatcher answered, I heard myself trying to sound normal, like calm would make the situation real. "There's someone in my house," I said. "They put a mannequin in my hallway. I think someone is inside it." There was a pause, the kind that means disbelief, and then my dog hit the hallway door with his body and barked like he was trying to throw himself through it. The dispatcher stopped sounding doubtful. Red and blue light bled through the snow minutes later. When I finally opened the bedroom door with 2 officers behind me, the hallway was empty. The mannequin was gone. Not pushed aside, not hidden behind furniture. Gone. The back door was unlocked, and on the kitchen tile there was a partial boot print in melted slush. The older officer stared at the print, then looked at me and said "start" at the last normal moment. So I told him about the boutique window at the mall where I work, closing shifts. A week earlier I had walked past that boutique and stopped cold, because one of their mannequins was dressed exactly like me down to the knit beanie in the same cheap scarf pattern. I laughed at myself, snapped a quick picture, and kept walking. When I passed again 10 minutes later, the boutique gate was down and the lights were off. But the mannequin's head was turned slightly toward the corridor, angled in a way that made it feel like it had followed me with its gaze. I stood there longer than I should have, shifting left and right to prove it was just perspective and the head stayed trained on me. I finally walked away with that prickly feeling that I had done something wrong by noticing. Tonight with the storm building, that memory came back as I drove home. Snow swallowed the edges of my headlights, and every time I checked my rearview mirror, I had the irrational sense that something upright and pale was keeping pace just out of view. When I pulled into my driveway, my porch light was on, even though I was sure the bulb had been dead. I told myself I must have replaced it, and forgotten. I went inside anyway, checked the rooms, checked the locks, and forced myself to stop acting like a scared kid. Then I woke up to the mannequin in my doorway. The officers did a full sweep, including the basement, the closets, the attic access. They found nothing but that boot print, and the disturbed snow by my back steps. They started to take my statement at the kitchen table, and I kept looking toward the hallway because my brain had already learned to expect a shape there. While the older officer wrote, my dog ran to the front window and started growling again. The older officer stopped mid-sentence and raised his flashlight. Across the street, under the streetlight, a mannequin stood upright in the snow, wearing my coat and scarf, facing my house. No tracks led to it. Snow drifted clean around its feet like it had been placed there, and the storm had politely covered the evidence. The officer crossed the road with his hand near his holster and grabbed the mannequin by the shoulder. It fell too easily. My coat opened, and the flashlight beam revealed a hollow shell. A crude human-sized frame lined with foam and wire, still warm inside like it had recently held a body. There were hand warmers taped to the ribs. Taped to the interior was a cheap burner phone, with my street on the screen and the camera app open pointed toward where my bedroom would be. I felt my stomach drop as the officer said low and tight, "It's a decoy." They rushed everyone back inside and searched. Again, harder opening doors, faster checking corners, twice, lifting rugs, pulling curtains. In the laundry room behind stacked boxes that had not been there earlier, they found the crawlspace hatch. It was slightly open, just enough to look like a shadow line. When they yanked it wide, cold air rolled out with the smell of damp insulation and old dirt. A man was wedged inside, between pipes, wrapped in fiberglass like a cocoon. His hands were raw and red, and his eyes snapped to me the moment they dragged him out that same fixed stare I had felt in the boutique window. He kept whispering I did not touch anything, like fingerprints were the only thing that mattered. They cuffed him and led him past my bedroom door, and he turned his head just enough to look at the spot where the mannequin had been standing when I woke up, like he was measuring it for next time. The older officer told me the man had been breaking into empty stores after closing, stealing mannequins, stealing clothes, learning which neighborhoods were quiet, and using the storm to cover his approach. The mannequin wasn't haunted. It was worse. It was a tool designed to turn my own eyes against me. After the squad car left, the older officer stayed a moment and said very quietly, "People fear mannequins because they look human enough that your brain fills in the rest. Predators live in the rest." By morning, the storm had erased most footprints, but it could not erase the lesson. I threw my coat away. I replaced every lock. None of it mattered. What mattered was the new rule my body learned in one night. If something looks human and stands too still, do not wait for it to move, because the movement you miss will be the movement that gets it inside. Now every time I pass a dark window and see my reflection, I hold my stare a little too long, because my brain remembers how fast a harmless shape can become a hiding place the second you look away. The Scarecrow was on my porch when I looked up from the sink, and my first thought was that I had finally lost my mind from staring at snow all week. It had my old flannel shirt on the one with the torn elbow and a burlap head with a stitched smile. Its arms were stretched wide like it was about to hug the door. The problem was simple. My Scarecrow was supposed to be 50 yards away, planted at the far end of my garden beside the fence line. I built it in October to keep deer off my winter greens, and after the first snow, it had looked ridiculous. A man-shaped joke, half buried in white. Now it stood on my porch boards, close enough that the porch light threw a clean shadow behind it. I stood perfectly still, dishwater dripping from my hands, listening. The house was quiet, except for the wind worrying the eaves. The Scarecrow did not move. That should have settled it, but the stillness felt deliberate, the way a person freezes when they know they have been seen. I reached for my phone and zoomed in on the burlap face through the glass. The stitched smile looked darker than I remembered, like the threads were wet. A tiny string of icicles hung from the chin, and under that right, where a neck would be, the flannel collar rose and fell once, barely as if something beneath it had taken a careful breath. 2 days earlier, I had joked to my wife that the Scarecrow looked like it was turning its head. It started as a harmless detail, the kind you point out when cabin fever is setting in. Every time I went outside to shovel, it seemed angled differently, as if it had rotated to watch the house. I told myself the wind had twisted the post. Then I noticed the distance. The Scarecrow was closer to the shed than it had been, closer by the length of a shovel handle. I went out with my boots sinking into powder and measured it, because measuring things is how you argue with fear. The base post was set deep. It should not have shifted. There were no footprints leading to it, no drag marks, nothing that explained why it kept reappearing nearer. That night I set a trail camera on the fence, aimed at the garden. The next morning the Scarecrow was in the same place, and the camera had recorded nothing but grey clips of blowing snow. Every file had the same timestamp repeating, like the device had been reset over and over. I replaced the batteries, checked the settings, and told myself it was the cold. But when I walked back to the house, I caught the Scarecrow in the corner of my eye. and the movement I imagined was so convincing, my stomach tightened as if I had actually seen it shift its weight. By the time the storm hit in earnest, we were snowed in. My wife left before it got bad to stay with her sister in town, and I stayed behind to keep the pipes from freezing. The world narrowed to the porch, the driveway, and the grey line of trees beyond the field. That is when the Scarecrow started showing up in places it did not belong. Not all at once, but gradually, like a bad idea gaining confidence. First, by the shed, then by the chicken coop, then at the edge of the yard just beyond the porch, light arms outstretched like it was trying to claim the house. Each time I went outside to check, it was just wood and straw and cloth. Each time I went back inside, I felt watched, and I hated myself for how fast my brain could turn a stuffed figure into a threat. So when I looked up from the sink and saw it on my porch, I did not open the door. I did not step outside to prove anything. I backed away and called 911, and I hated how my voice sounded thin and embarrassed, like I was reporting a prank. While I waited, I watched through the peephole. The Scarecrow stood so still that for a moment I almost believed it was exactly what it looked like. Then the wind shifted, and its sleeve lifted just enough to reveal a human wrist, inside the cuff pale against the straw. When the deputies arrived, their headlights washed the porch white, and their boots finally cut the first real prints into the snow. One of them walked up with his flashlight raised, and spoke loudly as if sound could force honesty. "Hey, step away from the door." The Scarecrow did not react. The deputy moved closer and jabbed it with the end of his flashlight. The body gave slightly, not like wood, like muscle. The deputy swore and grabbed the Scarecrow's arm. The burlap head turned a sharp, controlled motion that made my skin go cold, and I heard a faint, wet inhale through the cloth. The deputies tackled it on my porch. Straw burst out in clumps, scattering across the boards, like a nest ripped open. Under the flannel was a man in layered clothes, face wrapped in cloth, eyes bright with panic and fury. He fought like someone who had been holding himself still for hours and suddenly needed all the movement at once. They cuffed him hard, and as they hauled him to his feet, my porch light caught something strapped under his jacket, zip ties, tape a small knife in a sheath. One deputy looked at me and shook his head, like he was angry at the idea of it. After they secured him in the cruiser, they walked the property with me, flashlights cutting through the blowing snow. Behind the garden, they found a shallow trench where someone had been crawling low along the fence line, pushing snow back over the trail, with a board making the yard look untouched. They found a second burlap head, hidden in the brush, and a bundle of clothes wrapped in plastic. They found the trail camera I'd set, not broken, but turned around to face the woods, as if someone had wanted me to record the wrong direction, while the real problem stood right in front of my house. When they finally drove away, my porch was a mess of straw and snow and scuffed boards, and the Scarecrow was just scraps again. That should have ended it, but it did not. Because once you have watched a human being hide inside a costume and let your eyes slide right past them, your sense of what is real does not snap back to normal. The next morning, I stood at my kitchen window and looked out at the white yard and felt my body waiting for something to be there, arms outstretched, smiling. I realized the worst part was not that he moved the Scarecrow. The worst part was that he taught me how easy it is to move through a person's attention without being seen. Later, the deputy called to tell me the man had no connection to me at all. He had been drifting farm to farm, stealing clothes, building disguises, learning that people glance at scarecrows the way they glance at street signs, just enough to register, and then forget. In a storm, he could move a few feet at a time, crawl low, smooth the snow, and let my own doubt do the rest. That night, I swept straw off my porch for an hour, and I kept finding it in places it should not be, in hallway corners, in the laundry basket, even on my pillow, as if the costume had shed itself into the house to prove it had been real. The first time I saw it, I thought the storm was messing with my eyes because my backyard had become a blank, white sheet. I was at the kitchen sink when the motion light over my sliding door snapped on, and there it was, right in the middle of my fenced yard, a snowman, standing upright, like it had been waiting for the light to catch it. My yard is boxed in by a 6-foot privacy fence with a padlocked gate. I hadn't built anything back there. I don't even have kids. What tightened my throat wasn't the snowman, it was the snow around it. Smooth, wind, brushed, untouched. No footprints from the gate. No tracks from the fence line. Just clean snow, and then a snowman planted in the center, like it had been dropped from the sky. It was too perfect. 3 stacked balls, coal eyes reflecting my porch light with a wet shine. A scarf that looked more like torn cloth than something festive. And it was facing my kitchen. I filmed through the glass because recording felt safer than thinking. The snowman didn't move. It just stood there while the wind hissed against the fence and falling snow tried to blur the edges of everything. After a minute of nothing happening, my adrenaline turned into anger at myself. I pulled on boots, grabbed a shovel, and stepped onto the deck. The cold made my eyes water instantly, and my breath came out loud in bursts that sounded too much like panic. I checked the gate first. Padlock intact, chain-tight snow on the latch undisturbed. I traced the fence line with my phone, light expecting a loose plank or a broken section. Nothing. When I turned back, the snowman's details looked worse. Up close, the arms were thin rods, too straight, pushed into place with intention. The mouth wasn't pebbles at all, just a curved line pressed into the snow, like a smile drawn with a finger. Fresh. I took 3 steps into the yard and stopped because my boots sank deep with a crunch that would be impossible to hide. I stared at my own new footprints and then at the untouched field between the deck and the snowman. Whoever built it hadn't walked around it. There was no churned ring, no disturbed snow. It was like the builder had never touched the yard. I raised the shovel and said loud enough to carry, "This isn't funny." The words vanished into the storm and the snowman did not react, which somehow felt like a choice. My phone buzzed. A text from my sister. "You staying warm? Roads are awful." I glanced down for half a second, and when I looked up, the snowman's head looked angled slightly differently, as if it had turned to keep me centered. I told myself it was perspective, but my hands were shaking hard enough that the shovel handle squeaked in my grip. I backed toward the deck without taking my eyes off it, and went inside, locking the door behind me. I did a stupid fast sweep of my house. Closets, garage door, basement, latch. Because the yard being impossible made my brain jump to the next thought. If he didn't come through the fence, maybe he came through me. Everything was locked. Everything looked normal. That should have calmed me. It didn't. I set an old indoor camera on the counter aimed at the yard and watched the grainy feed while the storm thickened. For a while, nothing changed. Then the feed flickered one ugly jump, and for a single frame the snowman looked closer, larger, like the camera had been nudged. At the same time, the motion light blinked off, then on again. I leaned to the real glass and saw a faint shadow near the fence, low and narrow like something had been dragged flat against the snow. Not footsteps. A smear. Someone had moved without standing. And then it clicked. If you don't want footprints, you don't walk. You crawl. Still crawling would leave a trail, unless you never touched the snow at all. I ran to the garage and found the missing piece immediately. The blue tarp I used for yard waste was gone from its hook. Back at the window, I finally spotted it, an edge of plastic tucked under the drift at the base of the snowman. The rest was buried under a thin layer of fresh snow, smoothed so clean it blended into the yard. Someone had laid the tarp from the fence line to the center of my yard, walked on it while they built the snowman, then covered it again so the yard looked untouched. The snowman wasn't magic. It was a trap for my attention. As soon as I understood that, I heard a soft sound behind me, a light tap against the sliding glass, not from inside but from outside. Tap, 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 like a knuckle testing thickness. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I kept my eyes on the yard, because the moment I turned, my head felt like permission. The tapping came again higher on the glass, this time as if whoever was out there had stood up for a second. I saw the motion light flare brighter, and in that bright wash, the snowman's shadow looked wrung too narrow at the waist, like there was a person-shaped gap inside it. My throat went dry. I brought the phone to my ear and called 911. "There is someone in my backyard," I said. "They built a snowman inside my fence. No footprints. I think they used a tarp. The dispatcher told me to stay inside to lock everything to keep away from the windows. I stayed inside. I locked everything again. I did not stop watching. While I waited, the snowman began to do something subtle that felt worse than a jump scare. It inched. Not a full step, not a dramatic slide, just a quiet settling forward that could have been snow, except the base compressed like weight. The head dipped a fraction, then held still again. It was the smallest movement in the world, and it told me there was a body in there, fighting cramps and numb legs, and the urge to breathe too loud. When cruiser lights finally painted the fence red and blue, the snowman froze. Officers stayed on my deck, and in my side yard, flashlights cutting through the falling snow. One of them used a long rake from my garage to hook the scarf and yank hard. The top ball collapsed with a wet slap, and a man's face flashed in the light. Pale red-nosed eyes squeezed shut against the cold. He tried to rise, but his legs were numb, and his clothes were layered in white fabric dressed to disappear inside a storm. They dragged him out of the collapsing shell and pinned him in my yard while he coughed and gasped, his breath finally visible in frantic clouds. He kept insisting he was just passing through, like my yard was a road. They found a small knife, duct tape, and a set of house keys that were not mine. They also pulled a burner phone from the snowman's hollow frame. On the screen was a blurry photo of my kitchen window taken from inside the yard. He'd been watching me watch him, collecting the exact angles where I stood, learning what light made me feel safe. After they hauled him away, the officers dug out the top, folded with the neatness of practice, and a flat board used to smooth fresh snow over plastic, so it looked untouched. One asked me, how long has it been there? I wanted to say, only tonight. But the truth was, I didn't know, and that was the point. By dawn, the storm softened into light flurries, and my yard looked normal again. Smooth, snow, quiet fence, no sign of struggle. That's what stays with me, how easily a person can hide inside something childish, and how the absence of footprints can be more terrifying than their presence because it means someone planned to be invisible while standing in the open. The knocking was so small at first that I tried to blame the house the way you blame old pipes for noises you don't want to name. Tap, 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 3 quick clicks against the front door, like a child's knuckle. I froze on my couch with my phone in my hand, listening for it to become something bigger. It didn't. It stayed polite. Then it stopped. I told myself the wind had tossed something against the porch. I told myself it was snow sliding off the roof. I told myself anything that let me keep sitting there alone, while the storm outside turned the street into a dark tunnel. 5 minutes later it happened again, tap, tap, tap. Same rhythm. Same spot, right at the height where the door handle is. I leaned toward the peephole and looked out into the porch light's weak circle, and what I saw made my stomach drop. On the welcome mat, scented like it had been placed there for a photo, sat my garden gnome. It was supposed to be in the flower bed by the walkway, half buried in snow, a silly ceramic thing with a red hat and a white beard. Now it sat right in front of my door, facing inward, as if it had come to visit. I watched through the peephole for a full minute. Nothing moved. The gnome just sat there grinning, its painted eyes catching the light in a way that looked too glossy, too alive. I could have laughed at myself. A gnome doesn't walk. A gnome doesn't knock. And yet, the memory of that tiny tapping was still in my bones. Then I noticed something that didn't fit the gnome's hat. Had a dusting of fresh snow on top, but the beard was dry, like it had been undercover until moments ago. I checked my deadbolt. I checked the chain. I checked the little wedge alarm I kept under the door because I'd watched too many true crime videos and sworn I wouldn't be the person who said, "I never thought it would happen to me." The tapping came again, closer, sharper, tap, 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 and this time I heard a faint scrape right after it, like something dragging lightly across the mat. I called my neighbor across the street, because saying it out loud to another human felt like a test of reality. She answered groggy and annoyed, then went quiet when I asked if she had come over or moved anything on my porch. "No," she said. "Are you okay?" Before I could answer, the porch light flickered. In the peephole view, the gnome's shadow stretched and shrank like it was breathing. My neighbor's voice dropped to a whisper. "Do you want me to call the cops?" I said yes and hated how relieved I felt saying it. While she called, I opened my security app and pulled up the door camera feed, expecting to see the gnome sitting harmlessly. The live video showed my porch. It showed the gnome. It also showed something else I hadn't noticed. Through the peephole, my gnome was slightly turned to the right, angled toward the narrow gap between my porch column and the wall, like it was looking at a hiding place. I zoomed until the pixels broke apart. Behind the gnome in that gap, the darkness was too thick, too structured. Not empty space. A person pressed flat against my siding, wearing a hood and a white painter's mask that made their face look blank. My mouth went dry. The figure didn't move like it knew the camera couldn't see what didn't change. Then the tapping started again, and I understood the trick. The taps weren't coming from the gnome. The gnome was the tool. The masked figure extended a gloved hand from the dark, barely into frame, and tapped the gnome's ceramic hat against my door 3 times. Tap, 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 then pulled back. It was so careful, so controlled that my brain tried to turn it into a prank, because the alternative was too personal. The figure shifted, and I saw the glint of thin metal in their hand, something meant for locks. I backed away from the door and grabbed the biggest kitchen knife I owned anyway, because fear makes you collect useless objects. On my phone, the masked figure leaned closer to my lock, then stopped like it had heard something inside. The gnome moved again, nudged a few inches into a new position that blocked the camera's view of the lock. It wasn't haunted. It was being used like a curtain. My porch light clicked off, not flickered off. The screen on my phone switched to night mode, and the porch became a smear of black and gray. In that darkness, the gnome's eyes looked like 2 pale dots, and the gap behind it looked like a mouth. Tap, tap, tap. Came again, louder, now impatient. A voice whispered from outside, soft enough that it could have been the wind. Open up. I didn't answer. I watched the live feed as the figure's hand reached toward the doorknob and tested it with a slow twist. Locked. The figure paused, then raised the gnome and pressed it against the door at peephole height, like it was trying to block my view from inside. For a second, the camera caught a close-up of the gnome's hat, and I saw something I'd never noticed before. A tiny drilled hole under the brim so small it looked like a defect. A hole that shouldn't be there. Sirens approached faint and far. The figure stepped back into the darkness, then reached down, twisted the gnome's hat, and pulled. The hat came off cleanly like a lid. Inside was a small black device, battery wires, a lens no bigger than a pencil tip, a camera. They had hollowed out my garden gnome and turned it into a peephole pointed straight at my living room. They had been watching my lights, my routines, my silhouette moving through my own house. The figure shoved the device into a pocket and tapped the gnome to the door one last time, tap, 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 like a goodbye. Then they slipped out of frame toward the side of my house. When the police finally arrived and flooded the porch with light, the gnome was back on the mat, intact, smiling. The masked figure was gone. They found fresh scuffs near the porch column, where someone had stood for a long time without shifting, and shallow tracks in the snow that looped to the side yard and vanished where the wind had drifted over them. An officer picked up the gnome and frowned at the weight. "This is lighter than it should be," he said, and he found the clean cut where the hat had been twisted off before being reseated. After they left, I carried the gnome to my kitchen sink like it was contaminated and set it in the trash. Then I froze, because I couldn't remember if the gnome had been in the flower bed that morning. I couldn't remember if the hat's little drilled hole had always been there. I couldn't remember the last time I looked closely at something harmless. Now when the wind rattles my porch rail, my body still waits for 3 polite taps, because the worst part of that night wasn't the white mask. It was the idea that something cute and stupid could be turned into a messenger, and that the sound of a tiny knock can be an intruder practicing how to make you open the door for them. 2 days later, I woke to a motion alert at 3:12 a.m. The clip was 8 seconds long and showed nothing but my porch light turning on, and my gnome sitting perfectly centered on the mat hat on grin fixed. No person. No movement. Then the light clicked off again. In the morning, the gnome was back in the flower bed, half buried, facing my front window as if it had decided that was the better view. I couldn't find clear footprints to explain the reset. That's when I stopped arguing with my senses and accepted the simplest rule. If an object looks like it moved, assume someone moved it, and assume they want you to step closer. The statues in the park always faced the path, but after the storm they faced me. I don't mean that in a poetic way. I mean, I walked my usual loop at dusk, because cabin fever makes you do reckless things just to feel air, and the first bronze figure I passed had its head turned slightly to the left, angled toward the benches, where I stood to tighten my twirth. Gloves. It shouldn't have been able to turn at all. The statue was a memorial piece, heavy and bolted into a stone base, a man in a long coat with one hand outstretched, as if offering directions. I had seen it 100 times. That day his outstretched hand seemed to point directly at me. Snow had piled in drifts along the path and muffled everything, so my boots sounded too loud in the quiet. The wind in the branches made a low creaking that came and went like someone shifting weight behind you. I told myself the head only looked turned because the shadows were different, because the sun was low and my eyes were tired. Then I passed the second statue and stopped so hard my heel slipped. This one was a woman holding a book against her chest. Her face, usually set toward the playground, was angled toward the path toward me. Not much, just enough that if you weren't looking for it, you'd miss it. But I was looking. I had been looking too much lately, scanning snowmen and gnomes and mannequins like my life depended on noticing the wrong detail. I raised my phone to take a picture, as proof for myself. The moment I lifted the camera, I saw my reflection in the screen, pale and distorted, and behind my reflection, in the black glass, a third shape that wasn't part of the park, a person standing too still beside the statue's base. I spun around. There was nothing but falling snow and the line of dark trees. When I turned back, my phone had focused on the statue's face. The bronze eyes were dark hollows. A fine line of fresh snow clung to the upper lids, as if the statue had been looking up moments ago and had just lowered its gaze. I walked faster, telling myself to stop feeding the paranoia. The path curved toward the little plaza, where 4 statues stood in a half circle, around a fountain that was frozen solid. I could see them from a distance. A soldier, a nurse, a worker, a child. In daylight they were harmless, sentimental. In the stormlight they looked like a jury. As I approached I realized something was different. They were closer to the path than they should have been. The plaza stones were visible in patches where the wind had scoured the snow away, and I could see scuff marks, fresh grey streaks against the pale stone leading from the bases. Drag marks. Someone had moved them. Not inches, feet. I stood at the edge of the plaza and felt my pulse thump in my ears. The statues were arranged, so their faces angled inward toward the center where the fountain was, but also outward toward the path, as if they were meant to catch you approaching no matter which direction you came from. That's when I noticed the first footprint. One human print deep and clean right behind the soldier's statue, placed so it would be hidden from the path. Then another behind the nurse. Whoever had done this didn't want to leave tracks where a casual walker would see them. They wanted the evidence tucked behind the stone and bronze, like a secret. I backed away slowly, trying not to make noise, and that was when the child's statue's head seemed to shift. Not a full turn. A tiny jerk like a person resetting their neck after holding still too long. I told myself it was a trick of the light. I told myself it was wind, even though wind doesn't move bronze. My mouth went dry. I tried to swallow and couldn't. I walked backward another step and heard a soft scrape metal on stone. Someone behind one of the statues inhaled. It was faint, but the cold made every breath visible, and in the dim light I saw a thin ghost of vapor bloom from behind the worker statue's legs and vanish. My body reacted before my brain could catch up. I ran. I ran along the path with my boots slipping on packed snow, and the whole time I expected the statues to be behind me, not walking, just appearing closer each time. I dared to glance back. I didn't look back. I remembered the snowman rule. Don't blink. Don't turn. Don't give your attention away. When I finally hit the street and the yellow glow of a traffic light, I fumbled my phone and called 911. I told them there was someone in the park, moving statues. I heard myself saying it and knew how it sounded. The dispatcher asked if I was safe. I said no because my breath was ragged and my hands wouldn't stop shaking, and because the park felt like it was behind me, like a mouth. Police arrived in minutes. They drove their cruiser right up to the park entrance and flooded the plaza with light. I stood on the sidewalk and watched, too ashamed to go back in and too scared to leave. The officers walked to the statues, shining flashlights behind them, checking the bases, the trees, the benches. They found a small wheeled dolly hidden in the shrubs and a coil of rope. They found fresh boot prints leading in from the service road that runs behind the park. And behind the worker statue, tucked against the base where the shadow was deepest, they found a man in a dark coat, pressed flat to the stone, holding his breath so hard his face was mottled from the cold. In his hand was a small metal tool, the kind used to loosen bolts. He had been turning statue heads on their mounts, loosening, adjusting, tightening, just enough to make them look like they were watching. He had also been dragging the bases a few feet at a time to shift their positions and create the illusion that the park itself had changed while the storm erased the obvious evidence. When they pulled him out, he didn't fight. He just stared past them toward the path, like he was disappointed the scene had ended early. In his backpack, they found a notebook with crude sketches of the park layout and times written beside them. Dusk, late night, early morning, like he had been studying when people were alone. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a curse. He was a person, using the oldest trick in the world, make you feel watched. So you start watching for him, and then use the moment you look at the wrong thing to move. On the way home, I kept my eyes on the road and tried to breathe normally. The storm kept creaking the trees, and every time a branch shifted, I felt my shoulders rise. When I got inside my house, I locked the door and leaned against it, listening to my own heartbeat. I told myself it was over. Then my phone buzzed with a new notification. A motion alert from my porch camera. The clip showed my porch light turning on. It showed nothing else moving, but in the background across the street, where the neighborhood kid's snowman had been earlier in the week, there was now a new shape under the streetlight. Something tall and pale and still facing my house, as if it had been there all along. I stared at the screen until my eyes hurt because the park had taught me a second rule. If something inanimate looks like it has a plan, someone alive is nearby. I took the night shift at the Wax Museum because it was easy money, and because I told myself the creepiness was part of the charm. Tourists love pretending to be scared of lifeless figures. Employees learn to joke about it. They move when you're not looking, we'd say to new hires, and everyone would laugh because everyone knew it wasn't true. The first week I worked alone, the building stopped feeling like a joke. The museum sits on the edge of downtown, 3 floors of dim rooms and velvet ropes with motion sensors that trigger lights in sections as you walk. At night, the HVAC clicks and sighs and the wax smells faintly sweet like old candles. The cameras show grainy black and white feeds that make every figure look more alive than it is, because shadows do half the work for free. On my third night, at 1:11 a.m., the motion sensor in the President's Hall triggered even though I was sitting at the front desk. I watched the monitor as the lights in that hall flicked on in sequence, 1 row at a time like someone was walking. Then the lights shut off again. I radioed my supervisor out of habit, forgetting nobody was there. The building settled. The monitors showed only stillness, Lincoln, frozen mid-speech, Roosevelt's grin, a row of faces that always looked like they were about to say your name. I told myself it was a sensor glitch. Then it happened again at 1:27. Lights on, progressing deeper into the hall. Lights off. As if a person had walked in, paused, and then vanished before reaching the end. I grabbed my flashlight and did the round. Policy said you check. Policy also said you don't touch the figures. I walked the velvet-roped paths and swept my beam across wax faces. The light made their eyes shine and their skin look wet. It was hard not to flinch. In the President's Hall, everything looked normal, except for one detail that was so small I almost missed it. The Ronald Reagan figure's head was angled slightly toward the rope, toward the path, when I was certain it usually faced forward. I stopped and stared. It's incredible how quickly your brain assigns intent to a tilt. I forced myself to be rational. The figures are sometimes adjusted by day staff for photos. A bump can shift them. I took a step closer, and my flashlight caught a thin line at the base of the figure's neck. Not wax, Fabric, like a collar under the suit. Wax figures don't have fabric collars under their clothes. They have foam wire bolts. My skin went cold. I backed up slowly and swung my light to the floor. There were footprints in the dust, near the baseboards fresh, not mine. The museum keeps the floors polished, but corners collect grime, and grime preserves evidence. I followed the prints to the service door at the far end of the hall. The door was supposed to be alarmed. The red light above it was off. Someone had disabled it. I didn't call out. I didn't announce myself. I walked backward, keeping my light on the row of wax faces, because if someone was hiding among them, the last thing I wanted was to turn my back. That's when the lights shut off. The entire hall went dark, not the normal timed fade, a full blackout. My flashlight beam became the only vision, and the figures outside the beam became silhouettes. Human silhouette. I could feel my body trying to shrink, trying to make itself smaller. Behind the Reagan figure, a soft sound, a breath drawn in through teeth, controlled and quiet. The beam shook as I raised it. The Reagan figure's eyes were wrong, too deep, too wet. Then the figure blinked. Not a trick, not a shadow. A human blink. I ran. I sprinted down the velvet path and hit the corner hard, slamming, and the motion sensors triggered lights behind me, one by one, chasing me through the building like footsteps. I barreled into the lobby and slammed the security gate, locking myself behind the desk. I called 911 with my hands so numb I could barely hold the phone. "There's someone inside," I said. "They're hiding as a wax figure." The dispatcher asked me to describe the intruder. I almost laughed hysterical, because how do you describe someone who has turned themselves into a prop? I watched the monitors while I waited, and that's when the worst part happened. On the camera feed, the president's hall was dark. Then the lights came back on, and the Reagan figure was no longer in its spot. There was an empty space on the platform like a missing tooth. The velvet rope was unhooked and drooped toward the walkway, as if someone had stepped through. The next camera showed the horror icons room, ironic of course, where a row of monsters stands behind a rope for selfies. In that room, one figure had its back turned to the camera. It hadn't before. It was standing just outside the rope, not behind it, facing the door that leads to the lobby. It was waiting. I felt something hot flood my chest, a pure animal fear that made me want to vomit. I ducked below the desk as the lobby lights flickered. I heard a soft scrape near the front doors, like someone dragging a shoe lightly to be quiet. Then a voice low and calm came from the other side of the security gate. "I'm just trying to get warm." I didn't answer. I listened for the sound of police sirens, and when I finally heard them, it was like air returned to the room. Officers entered with guns drawn, sweeping corners, calling commands. They found the intruder on the second floor, tucked behind a row of wax tourists, wearing a stolen suit jacket, face dusted with makeup to match the figures, standing perfectly still, with his eyes half-lidded, so he looked molded. He had been practicing, they told me later. Practicing stillness. Practicing being overlooked. In his bag was a small kit, spirit gunpowder, a cheap brush, and a printed map of the museum. He wasn't supernatural. He was patient. He knew people glance and assume. The next day when I came in to give my statement, the day staff had reset all the figures and turned the lights up brighter, as if brightness could erase what darkness had revealed. The Reagan figure faced forward again. The rope was hooked neatly. The museum smelled like wax and cleaning spray. Everything looked normal, but as I walked past the presidents, I still felt the urge to stare too long at their eyes, because the museum had taught me the ugliest version of automatonophobia. The fear isn't that the figure comes to life. The fear is that a living person can become a figure, and your brain will accept it, because accepting it is easier than admitting you're being hunted in plain sight. The ventriloquist doll said my name from the attic at 206A. M, bright and cheerful, like it was calling me downstairs for cake, and I sat up so fast. My sheets tangled around my legs because nobody in this neighborhood should have known my name yet. We'd moved in 3 days earlier, and winter had already turned the house into an instrument radiator. Ticks, roof, creaks, branches, scratching shingles, like fingernails. The previous owner left a few plastic totes in the garage and promised they were just holiday junk, and I believed him, because believing people is easier than believing. You're the kind of person who buys a house with a stranger still inside. The first night I opened the totes to clear space. Most of it was harmless lights, tinsel, a cracked ceramic angel. But the last tote was heavier than it should have been, and inside was the doll wrapped in a towel like someone had been trying to keep it quiet. Painted grin, 2 wide eyebrows arched in, permanent mischief, glassy eyes that caught light the way real eyes do when you don't want them to, and a jaw lever in its back. My wife, Marissa, took one look and said, "Get rid of it." I didn't throw it away right then because I told myself I wasn't superstitious, and because stupidly I felt like throwing it away would admit it bothered me. So, I did the compromise thing. I carried the tote to the hallway ceiling, access pulled down the attic ladder, shoved it into the dark, and clicked the hatch, shut like I was sealing off a separate world. On the second night, around midnight, I noticed the latch wasn't fully seated. Not open, just not clicked. I pushed it up, heard it catch, and went back to bed. In the morning, Marissa asked if I'd been up late, because she'd heard a thump overhead around 2. I said no and blamed the wind, because blaming the wind is what you do when you don't want to say out loud that your ceiling has a sound that feels like a footstep. On the third night, at 2:06, the voice came. "Evan," it said from above, the drywall stretched like a joke. I lay still, with my heart pounding, waiting for Marissa to wake, and when she didn't, I stepped into the hallway barefoot, staring up at the attic hatch. The latch hung loose again, a thin black line in the ceiling. I told myself the tote had shifted that, plastic had clicked, that my half-asleep brain had turned it into a voice because it already hated that doll. Then it said my name again softer, like it had moved further down the attic. A sound from above your head does something primal. It makes you feel like prey. I dragged a chair under the hatch and cracked it open, just enough to shine my phone light into the dark. Rafters insulation, cardboard boxes, no movement, just a smell that didn't belong, stale, sweat under dust like someone had been warm up there recently. I shut the hatch hard and climbed down, telling myself I was overreacting. And then at 2:14 the voice returned, but it wasn't my name. Marissa, it sang, playful and patient. And Marissa finally sat up in bed and whispered, "What was that?" I swallowed and said, "Probably the house," which might be the dumbest sentence I've ever said. In the morning I climbed into the attic in full daylight, because daylight makes you brave enough to be wrong. The tote wasn't where I'd shoved it. It had been pulled closer to the ladder, like someone wanted it convenient. The lid wasn't snapped on. Inside, the towel was folded neatly, not crumpled, folded like a person, resetting a scene for the next act. And behind the doll was a cheap phone that wasn't ours. I pressed the button and it lit to a blank lock screen with nothing personal on it at all, just the time frozen like a signature 2:06. Marissa stared at it for a second and said flatly, "Someone's been in our attic." We checked doors, windows, the garage locked, until the only answers left were the ones nobody likes. Someone had a key, someone got in before we moved in, or someone never left. We called the non-emergency line and were told an officer could come by later that afternoon, and later suddenly felt like we were being asked to keep living under our own ceiling, as if nothing was wrong. So I bought a hasp lock for the attic hatch, and a motion camera screwed the hasp into the frame and hung a padlock so the panel couldn't open without a key. That night we left the hallway dark and watched the camera feed from bed, because you can't sleep when you know your house has a second story you can't see. Aduno cinzeci opta. The camera triggered. On the grainy screen, the attic panel flexed a fraction like pressure from above, testing it, then settled back down. At 2:06, the doll's voice came again, muffled, now trapped above the locked hatch. "Evan." My stomach dropped because it didn't sound like a toy. It sounded like audio played through a speaker. The camera feed flickered for 2 seconds, a glitch that felt like a blink, and when the image returned, the hallway was no longer empty. The doll sat on the runner rug, directly beneath the attic, hatch upright, hands on its knees, like a polite guest waiting to be acknowledged. The padlock still hung from the hasp in the ceiling. The hatch was still shut. The only way the doll got there was from inside the house. Marissa grabbed my arm and whispered, "Don't go out there, but fear does a cruel thing where it convinces you the only way to be safe is to confront what you're afraid of immediately, like bravery is a lock you can turn." I took the baseball bat from the closet and stepped into the hallway. The doll's painted smile looked brighter under the nightlight, and the lever in its back was pulled halfway down as if it had just spoken and was ready to speak again. Above it, the hatch sat closed and locked. Then a new sound came from somewhere beyond the drywall, deeper than the doll's voice, closer to a real throat, and it whispered, low and calm, "Open it." It wasn't shouting. It wasn't frantic. It sounded like someone giving instructions to a dog. That snapped something in me. I backed into the bedroom, locked the door, and called 911, with my voice barely steady enough to be understood. While I waited, I watched through the crack in the door as the doll's head turned slowly toward our bedroom, a steady rotation that made it feel less like a prop and more like a message. I heard a soft creak from the ceiling, not opening pressure, like someone shifting weight above the hatch and calculating. Police arrived fast, swept the attic first, and found the hasp screws turned from above, loosened just enough that the wood was starting to strip. They followed a narrow path, pressed into the insulation to the far eaves, where the roof dipped low, and there they found a man wedged behind stacked boxes with a sleeping bag, bottled water, and the kind of patience that can live in silence. For days, he had a tiny microphone, a small speaker taped inside the tote, and 2 phones, one to watch our camera feed through the Wi-Fi, and one to time the voice playback. The doll had been modified, a thin fishing line attached to its jaw, threaded through a pinhole in the tote lid, so he could pull it from above and make the mouth move in perfect sync with the audio. It wasn't haunted. It was rehearsed. When they dragged him down the ladder, he looked at me like I was the intruder and said, almost conversationally, "You put it so close to the hatch. You made it easy." After they took him away, an officer asked if we wanted the doll as evidence. I said no so quickly it didn't feel like a decision. We slept at a hotel, and the next day I returned with a locksmith and tried to see the hallway the way I'd seen it before, just walls, a rug, a quiet ceiling. But daylight can't erase what your brain has learned. Near the baseboard I noticed a faint smear like paint dragged by tiny shoes, and half tucked under the radiator was the doll's jaw lever, snapped clean off and left behind like a reminder that something had sat in my hallway and waited for me to treat it like a toy. People fear dolls because they look human enough for your mind to fill in the rest. The real horror is realizing someone alive can hide in that rest, and once your brain accepts the outline, it stops looking for the human inside. The frozen prank only lasted 30 seconds, but it rearranged the way my brain trusts what it sees for the rest of my life. It was supposed to be harmless, a winter party, a blizzard outside, and my little brother Dylan and his friends filming one of those videos, where someone stands perfectly still like a statue, while everyone else acts normal. Then the statue suddenly moves to scare, a reaction. Cabin fever makes people invent games, and the storm had turned our street into a muffled tunnel of white where you could barely see the mailbox from the window. Dylan had been hyping the prank all night, whispering about angles and lighting like he was directing a movie because the whole point was to make it look real enough that the viewer's brain would do the rest. "We're gonna do a frozen one," he said, grinning like the world stops. The plan was simple. One friend would wear a white Tyvek suit from his dad's work, stand outside the living room window in the snow like a human-shaped drift, and the second I glanced away, he'd shift closer, just enough to give that uncanny feeling that something inanimate had moved. Everyone would laugh. We'd post it. End of story. I should have said no. Instead, I played along because I didn't want to be the uptight older brother who ruins the joke, and because part of me thought I was too grown to be scared of a guy in a white suit. They killed the lights in the living room, except for the glow of the TV and the porch light spilling through the front window. Dylan started recording on his phone and said, "Okay, freeze," and the room went still on purpose, friends mid-laugh. Someone holding a cup halfway to their mouth. Someone with their hand on the back of the couch, because stillness is funny when it's voluntary. Then Dylan nodded toward the window. Outside in the porch light, the white-suited figure stood in the yard, shoulders hunched, head slightly, bowed like a mannequin left out in a storm. The snow blew sideways, coating the suit in a thin dusting that made it look even less like a person. Dylan whispered, "Don't blink," like he was telling a ghost story, and I felt my skin prickle because that phrase is a trigger you don't notice until it's said in the exact wrong tone. I looked at the figure, then glanced down at Dylan's phone screen for half a second to see the framing, and when I looked back up, the figure looked closer. Not dramatically, but enough that my brain registered it as wrong. A laugh bubbled up in the room. Someone whispered, "Yo, that's creepy," and Dylan's grin widened because the prank was working. He gestured for everyone to keep freezing, and he mouthed, again. I stared at the figure through the glass and forced myself not to blink like I could catch the moment it moved. The wind rattled the porch railing. The figure did nothing. Then I blinked anyway because bodies blink, and when my eyes opened, the figure was at the edge of the porch steps, close enough that I could see the seam of the hood and the dark oval of the face opening. The room went quieter. A joke becomes a threat the instant you feel it stop being under your control. Dylan whispered, Okay, like he was about to call it off, and then the figure raised its head and looked straight at the window. The eyes behind the hood were too dark, too steady. Not playful, not performing. The figure lifted one hand slowly and pressed a palm against the glass, leaving a faint smear of moisture like breath and skin heat. That's when I realized the worst detail. There were no fresh footprints between the yard and the porch steps, no trail of churned snow that a guy would leave moving around to hit marks for a prank. The snow was wind-swept and smooth, except for one set of shallow, careful impressions near the side of the porch, like someone had approached low, staying out of the porch light, then risen into position at the last second. My mouth went dry. I turned my head and said, "Dylan, where's Mark?" Because Mark was the friend who owned the Tyvek suit. Dylan frowned, confused. "Mark's inside," he whispered, like I was ruining the take. And right then Mark stepped into the living room from the kitchen, holding a bag of chips, wearing jeans, and a hoodie. Not a white suit, not outside, not part of a joke. The room snapped from playful to silent so fast, it felt like the oxygen changed. Dylan lowered his phone. Mark followed our eyes to the window, and his face drained of color. Outside, the white-suited figure stayed perfectly still, palm still on the glass, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment when the prank collapsed into reality. Someone whispered, "Is that?" And nobody finished the sentence because finishing it meant admitting what it was, a stranger, using our own game to get close without being questioned. The figure tapped the glass once, with a knuckle, soft, polite, and then curled its fingers like it was testing for a latch through the frame. I backed away from the window and grabbed the fireplace poker because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. Dylan finally found his voice and said too loudly, "Hey, that's not funny." The figure didn't flinch. It turned its head slightly, a slow, controlled movement that made my stomach twist, and then it stepped sideways out of the porch light, disappearing into the darker strip beside the house, like it had been a shadow the entire time. We heard a soft scrape on the porch boards, then a faint click at the front doorknob, someone testing it gently like they were checking a hotel room. Locked. Another clicked the sound of metal near the lock, careful and practiced. Mark whispered, "Call the cops," and Dylan's hands shook so hard he dropped his phone once before he managed to dial. In the hallway, our coat rack stood near the front door with winter jackets hanging like limp bodies. In the dim light, the coats looked too human, and that's what the figure wanted, a room full of outlines that your brain can't stop interpreting. The lock clicked again, and then the porch light shut off. Not flickered shut off, like someone had reached up and turned it. The living room plunged into a deeper dark, and for a second, the only light was the TV, casting blue across faces, frozen in real fear, not the funny kind. That's when the doorbell camera notification popped on my phone. Motion detected. I opened the live feed and saw the porch in night vision. The front door filled the frame, and to the left, just at the edge, the white suit was visible again, pressed flat to the wall, not moving at all. It was using stillness, like camouflage. The figure held something thin in one hand, angled toward the lock. A pick, or a shim, or just a tool meant to make a door stop being a boundary, I whispered. "He's right there," and my voice sounded too small. The figure leaned forward a fraction and then stopped, as if it had heard us speaking. In the feed, it turned its head toward the doorbell camera, and for a moment the hood opening filled with a pale shape that looked like a mask, featureless and winter white, the kind that erases expression so you can't read intent. Then it did something that turned my blood cold. It raised one finger to the hood, opening in a slow shh gesture. Not a prank. Not a dare. A command. We backed into the kitchen as a group grabbing whatever felt like it could be a weapon, and we huddled with our phones and our breaths too loud in our ears, waiting for the sound of the door giving in. Instead, we heard a soft thump against the side door near the garage. Then another, like someone moving along the exterior, trying handles, checking for the one you forgot. Mark whispered, "He's looking for the easy way," and the phrase hit me hard because it sounded like a rule. Police sirens arrived, distant and thin, and the moment they grew louder, the thumps stopped. The doorbell camera feed showed the porch empty again, as if the soot had evaporated. Officers swept the property, found shallow tracks near the side of the porch that vanished under drifted snow, and found a discarded pair of thin gloves in the bushes, like someone had dropped them in a hurry. The next morning, Dylan tried to laugh it off the way teenagers do when they don't know what else to do with fear. "Dude, that prank was insane," he said, like the story could be made safe by calling it content. But I couldn't laugh because I kept seeing that white suit standing in our yard perfectly still, and I kept thinking about how we had taught ourselves to ignore it for the first few seconds. We had trained our own attention to say, "That's part of the joke, don't worry, don't react, keep filming." That's what made it frozen. Not the stillness outside. The way the people inside stopped moving towards safety because they thought they were watching entertainment. 2 nights later, Dylan deleted the video. He said it felt wrong to keep it. I agreed, but deletion doesn't undo the lesson. Now, whenever I look out at a snow-covered yard and see a shape that could be a decoration, a drift, a mannequin, a person, I don't think about ghosts. I think about how easy it is to hide in plain sight when everyone has been taught to treat the first warning signs as part of the show. I thought the statue in my backyard was just another piece of ugly yard art, until I realized it hadn't been there when I went to bed, and by the time I accepted that it had already been watching my kitchen window for hours. It was the kind of night where the snow falls so hard, it seems to press the neighborhood flat, muffling traffic, swallowing porch lights, making every house feel like it's alone on its own island. My wife was out of town. My phone had 1 bar. And I was doing that restless pacing people do when the weather traps you inside and your mind starts inventing problems just to feel busy. Around 1030, I washed a mug, looked out over the sink and noticed a pale shape near the back fence line, half in shadow, half in the spill of my motion light. At first, it registered as a garden statue, one of those concrete figures someone forgets about until it's buried in snow. It stood perfectly upright, with a blocky silhouette, shoulders squared, head slightly bowed. The weird thing was how clean it looked compared to everything else. The fence was frosted, the patio chairs were rounded by drifts, but the figure's edges stayed sharp like it was shedding snow instead of collecting it. I told myself I hadn't noticed it before because the storm was distorting depth and my eyes were tired. I watched for a minute waiting for a gust to blur it, but it didn't sway, didn't soften, didn't change. It just stayed there, facing my house, as if it belonged to the property line. I checked the side gate in my mind, the one that leads into the yard, and remembered locking it at dusk. I remembered checking it twice, because lately I'd gotten weird about locks, about anything that separated inside from outside. The shape stayed still. I tried to laugh at myself. People don't break into yards during a blizzard. Statues don't appear overnight. I went back to the living room and turned on the TV loud because noise makes you feel less alone. 15 minutes later, I drifted back to the kitchen and looked again. The figure was closer. Not dramatically, not like it had marched forward, but closer by, just enough that my brain did that fast, sick calculation. It had moved a few feet. I stared hard, forcing my eyes to pick reference points, and the storm cooperated by thinning for a second, revealing smooth snow between the fence and the statue, with no footprints, no drag marks, no churn. The absence felt louder than any evidence would have. I opened my phone camera and zoomed. The pixels broke apart, but I could make out texture on the figure's surface, mottled grey and white like concrete with ice glaze. The head was featureless from that distance, or maybe it was turned away. My mouth went dry. I didn't go outside. I didn't do the brave idiot thing. I locked the back door, even though it was already locked, and pulled the curtains halfway, leaving a thin slit, so I could keep the figure in view without standing in the open like a target in my own window. The motion light clicked off. 10 seconds later, it clicked back on brighter, as if it had sensed something new. The figure was now at the edge of my patio, right where the stepping stones begin. Still no footprints. I felt my heartbeat in my throat. I backed away from the window and grabbed the heaviest thing within reach, a cast iron skillet, because fear makes you pick tools you don't know how to use. I called 911, and as the phone rang, I kept thinking about how ridiculous I sounded in advance. But when the dispatcher answered and I said, "There's someone in my yard. I think they're pretending to be a statue," my voice cracked in a way that made it real enough for her to stop asking questions and start giving instructions. "Stay inside. Lock everything. Do not confront them," she said, and I promised, even though my eyes kept dragging back to that slit in the curtain like it was a magnet. The figure didn't move for a long time after that, and that was almost worse, because time is what makes your mind invent the wrong explanations. Maybe it was a real statue, and I was spiraling. Maybe it was the neighbors and it had been there for years. Maybe the snow was playing tricks. Then, the figure shifted its weight. It was tiny, subtle, a micro movement that you would never notice if you weren't already staring like your life depended on it. The shoulders lowered a fraction, the head angled up by degrees the way a person adjusts after holding still for too long. A thin puff of vapor slipped from where a mouth would be and vanished in the cold. I stepped back so fast I bumped the counter. The dispatcher heard the noise and asked if I was okay. I said yes, lying because I didn't want to admit how close the fear felt. I moved to the hallway where I could still see the yard through a side window, and I watched the figure the way you watch a sleeping animal you're afraid might be awake. Minutes stretched. The blizzard kept hissing against the glass. The figure stood at the patio edge, like it owned that space. Then my phone buzzed with a notification from my back door. Camera motion detected, and I didn't have to open the app to know what it would show. When I did, the feed made my stomach drop. The statue wasn't alone. Behind it, pressed low against the fence, was a second shape, darker, almost invisible in the storm, crawling along the base, like a shadow that had remembered how to detach. The statue was the distraction the thing meant to pull my attention forward, while the real movement happened where I wasn't looking. I whispered into the phone, "There's another one," and the dispatcher's voice got sharper. "Officers are 2 minutes out." On the feed, the crawling shape reached the corner of my house, near the basement window well, and disappeared into the blind spot beneath the camera's angle. I ran to the basement door and locked it, then realized with a cold flash that locking it now only proved how many minutes I'd been watched before I thought to. The statue finally moved again, not walking, just stepping forward once onto my patio stones with a careful heel-to-toe placement that wouldn't crunch loud. The motion light flared brighter. For the first time I could see its surface clearly, not concrete at all, but a grey hooded raincoat dusted with snow and sprayed with something pale to mimic stone. The face was covered by a cheap foam mask, with a blank, chiseled look, like a garden figure. The hands were gloved and held stiff at the sides. It stood there perfectly still again, as if it could switch motion on and off, like a feature. And then from my basement, I heard the faintest metallic click, a sound like a tool touching a window frame. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. Sirens finally threaded through the muffled night, growing louder, and in the same instant both shapes reacted. The crawling one slid back out into the yard and flattened into the snow, and the statue did something that will always haunt me. It froze harder, more convincingly, as if it believed stillness could erase it. Police lights turned the snow purple and blue. Officers came through my side gate with flashlights up, shouting commands. The statue didn't run until an officer's beam hit its mask, and the officer said, "That's a person." The figure bolted then, but its boots slipped on the patio stones and an officer tackled it into the drift. The second intruder tried to crawl away along the fence line, and got caught by another officer who followed the subtle depression in the snow like tracking a snake. When they hauled them up, both men looked hypothermic and furious faces, red lips, cracked eyes, bright, with that sick patience some people carry like a skill. In their backpacks were grey spray paint, foam masks, a roll of plastic sheeting, and a small pry bar wrapped to avoid clinking. One officer walked me through what they'd done. The plastic sheeting had been laid like a walkway from the side gate area, covered with a dusting of snow, letting them move without leaving a trail, then pulled back as they advanced so the yard looked untouched behind them. The statue had stood still for hours, he said, because humans glance at yard art and stop thinking. The other one used that glance, that moment your brain labels something harmless, to move where you won't notice. After they left, my patio stones were scuffed. My motion light kept flickering, and the yard looked normal again under fresh snowfall, as if the storm was trying to erase the story. I stood at the kitchen window until sunrise anyway, because the worst part wasn't that someone had been in my yard. The worst part was learning how easy it is for a living person to become an object in your mind, and how long they can stand in plain sight if you let your attention do what it's trained to do: register, dismiss, and look away. The Santa decoration on my porch wasn't inflatable, and I didn't understand that until I saw its belly rise with a slow, controlled breath that fogged my front window from the outside. It was 2 weeks before Christmas, the kind of week where everyone's yard is aggressively cheerful. Lights stapled to gutters, wreaths on doors, plastic reindeer glowing like mild hallucinations in the snow. My wife and I were late to decorating, so we did the lazy thing. We bought a big Santa lawn figure from a hardware store. One of those smiling Santas that waves with a mittened hand and stands beside a plastic present. It was cheap, it was tacky, it made the porch look done, and that was the point. The first night we put it out, it snowed hard, and by morning Santa looked half buried and ridiculous. His red hat dusted white, his grin unchanged. I shoveled the steps, knocked snow off the railing, and went to work without thinking about him again. That night, around 1140, our doorbell camera pinged. Motion detected. I opened the clip, expecting to see a cat or blowing branches. Instead, the footage showed Santa standing much closer to the front door than we'd placed him. Turned slightly so his waving hand was angled toward the doorknob like a hint. I replayed it 3 times, trying to spot the moment he moved, but the clip began with him already in that position. No person in frame. No obvious disturbance. Just Santa and falling snow. I told myself I must have misremembered where we set him, because admitting a decoration moved on its own is the kind of thought you correct out of embarrassment. The next day, my wife texted from her office, "Did you move, Santa?" I typed back, "No," then stared at my screen longer than I should have, because she had asked the question I'd been refusing to ask myself. When I got home, I walked straight to the porch to check the base. The figure was heavy molded plastic, with a metal stake frame, the kind that doesn't scoot easily. The stakes were now set deeper on one side than the other, like someone had re-anchored it. I looked down for footprints. The storm had kept coming and going, and fresh powder covered everything, but in the shallow corners near the wall, I found the faintest scuffs, toe marks, pressed close to the siding, where someone could move without being obvious to the street. It wasn't proof. It was suggestion, and suggestion is what keeps you awake. That night we left the porch light on and went to bed early, not because we were tired, but because we were pretending normal. At 2:13 a.m., I woke to the softest sound, a squeak like rubber on paint, followed by 3 gentle taps against the door. Not loud, not frantic, polite, like someone testing whether you're awake. My wife murmured, half asleep, "Who is that?" And I didn't answer because I was already listening for the next sound that would tell me whether it was real. The taps came again. I slid out of bed and opened the doorbell camera app, hands shaking enough that I hit the wrong icon twice. The live feed loaded black and white night vision washing my porch in ghost light. Santa stood directly in front of the door, now centered like he belonged there, his waving hand lifted in a frozen greeting. The plastic present beside him was gone. The space where it had been was an empty dark patch against the boards. I leaned closer to my phone screen and felt a surge of cold travel up my spine because Santa's beard looked wrong. It wasn't molded curls catching light. It had fibers, texture uneven clumps like real hair packed under fabric. The camera's infrared made the eyes look glossy and deep and not painted. I switched to the other camera angle that covers the porch from the side. In that view, Santa's back was against the wall, and I could see a narrow gap between the costume and the siding where something inside shifted. A slow inhale, a slow exhale. The taps came again, this time from low on the door like a knuckle near the lock. My wife sat up behind me and whispered, "Is that?" And I held up a hand for silence because sound felt dangerous. In the side-angle feed, Santa's mittened hand moved a fraction, not a friendly wave, a careful repositioning, so the arm blocked the camera's view of the doorknob. A tool flashed near the lock, thin metal catching infrared like a pale tongue. It wasn't a decoration. It was a person using the shape of a decoration to stand inches from my door without triggering the part of the human brain that screams intruder. It was also using the season itself as camouflage, because in December you expect weird shapes on porches. You expect Santa. You don't expect Santa to be looking at the lock. I backed away from the door and grabbed my phone charger cable like it was a weapon, which is pathetic, but fear is not a strategist. I dialed 911 and whispered my address. The dispatcher told me to stay away from windows and doors, to keep quiet, to wait for officers. I put my ear to the hallway wall anyway, because part of me needed to know if the lock was giving, if the boundary was turning into a suggestion. The tapping stopped. For a full minute there was only the hiss of wind and the faint tick of the thermostat. Then the porch light clicked off. Not flickered off like someone had reached up and turned the switch. My stomach dropped, because that meant the person in the Santa suit knew exactly where the switch was, and was comfortable enough to change the lighting like they owned the space. On the camera feed, the porch went into deeper night vision. Santa's face looked flatter, now more mask than joy. In that grey glow I saw something I hadn't seen before, a seam at the neck, where the Santa head met the collar, and just beneath the beard, a small triangle of skin, red with cold moving slightly with breath. My wife started to cry quietly, the kind of sound you can't control, and I pressed a hand over her mouth not to silence her feelings, just to keep the outside from hearing. In the side-angle feed, Santa leaned closer to the door, and the mittened hand settled on the knob with a patience that made me want to vomit. The knob turned, slowly. It held, locked. The hand stayed there anyway, resting as if the person on the porch was memorizing the exact resistance, the exact sound, the exact feel of our lock, preparing to try again when we were less alert. Then, from behind the Santa mask, a voice came through the door, muffled by fabric, but unmistakably human. "I know you're in there." It wasn't shouted. It was said the way someone speaks when they believe they have time. The dispatcher's voice crackled in my ear. Officers are 1 minute out. And in that final minute, the Santa did the most unsettling thing of all. He stepped back from the door and froze perfectly, as if he had switched back into being an object. He positioned himself at a slight angle that made him look decorative, harmless holiday. If a neighbor glanced out their window, they would see Santa on my porch and think nothing. The camera caught the stillness so cleanly it made me doubt my own eyes. Then cruiser lights washed the snow outside in blue and red. The Santa moved instantly, stepping off the porch with a speed that shattered the illusion and tried to slip along the wall toward the side yard. Officers rounded the corner and shouted commands. The Santa hesitated just long enough to decide whether stillness could save him again, then ran. He didn't get far. They tackled him into the drift beside my porch steps, and the costume tore, spilling white stuffing and revealing dark winter clothes underneath. Layered for cold, a cheap ski mask under the Santa head, and a set of lockpicks taped flat against his forearm for quick access. One officer lifted the torn beard and said, disgusted, "He's been standing here a while." In the pocket they found a small hand warmer pack, still hot, and a phone with my doorbell camera's model searched on the screen like he'd been learning how to find blind spots and delay alerts. After they took him away, my porch looked obscene in its normality. The wreath on the door, the string lights, the spot where Santa had stood like a joke. In the morning, neighbors asked about the police cars, and we lied with vague words, because it was easier than explaining that the thing that tried to get into our home wore a smile and a red suit and counted on our brains to label it festive. We threw the decoration away, obviously, but the season didn't stop. Every porch on my street still filled with Santas and snowmen and reindeer, all of them standing still in the snow, all of them shaped like harmless stories. And every night when I lock my door, I find myself listening for 3 gentle taps, because the worst part of that night wasn't the lockpick or the fret. It was realizing how easily danger can borrow the outline of something you're trained to trust, and how long it can stand at your door without being recognized as alive. The footprints started at the sidewalk and ended at the snowman, and that was the part that made my stomach drop, because the end is supposed to be the easy part. When you see tracks in fresh snow, you tell yourself the world is honest. Someone came here, someone left, and the snow recorded it like a receipt. But these prints were a receipt, with the last line missing. It was the first real snow of the season, the kind that makes everything look clean and forgiving, and by midnight, my neighborhood was quiet enough that you could hear the highway 3 miles away like a distant ocean. I couldn't sleep, so I did that pointless thing where you check the locks twice and stare out windows like you're guarding a castle that nobody wants. That's when I saw the snowman. It was at the edge of my front yard near the maple tree facing my house. I didn't have a snowman in my yard. I don't have kids. I hadn't even stepped outside since the snow started. The snowman looked crude, built fast, lopsided head, stick arms, 2 long scarf that looked more like a torn towel than something festive. It should have been almost funny. Instead, it made the air in my chest feel tight, because it had the one quality that makes something childish turn. Menacing, in an instant. It looked intentional. I turned on my porch light and watched for movement. Nothing. Just the snow falling in slow sheets, the yard bright in the cone of light, and that pale figure standing in it, like it had been waiting for the light to catch it. I told myself someone's teens were messing around. I told myself it was a prank. Then I looked down and saw the footprints. A single line of boot prints cut across the sidewalk through the curb cut over my lawn. They weren't messy or wandering. They were direct, like the person knew exactly where they were going, and they led straight to the snowman, right up to it. The last print stopped inches from its base. Beyond that, the snow was untouched, smooth, falling clean. No prints leaving, no scuffs, no stumble marks. It was like the person had walked into the snowman and been absorbed. My skin prickled. I leaned closer to the glass and realized something else. The snowman wasn't collecting fresh snow the way everything else was. Its surface stayed oddly clean, as if warmth inside it was melting each flake that landed and then refreezing it into a thin glaze. I stepped back from the window and pulled my phone out. My first instinct was to record, to make proof, so my fear couldn't be dismissed as imagination later. My second instinct was to call someone so I wasn't the only witness. I called my neighbor Frank, a retired guy who wakes up at 5 a.m. No matter what, and treats any disturbance like it's his job. He answered on the second ring, sleepy but alert. I told him to look out his window. There was a pause then, Frank said. "That's not yours," I said. "No." He said, "Don't go outside immediately," like his mouth had decided before his brain could argue. I watched through the glass, while Frank stayed on the line. I tried to find a rational explanation for the missing tracks. Wind could soften prints, sure, but not erase a departure line completely, while leaving the approach prints sharp. Snow can fill in a trail, but not that fast, not that clean, not within the time it took me to blink. I told myself, maybe the person walked backward, stepping into their own prints to leave the illusion of a one-way path. The thought was so clever and so ugly that it made my mouth go dry. If someone was doing that, it meant they weren't just in my yard by accident. They were performing. They wanted me to notice. Frank said, "I'm calling the police," and I didn't argue because my hands were shaking too hard to pretend I was above it. While he called, I pulled up my doorbell camera feed. The snowman was just beyond the camera's best angle, partly blocked by the maple tree. I could see the line of footprints clearly. Could see the snowman's lower body. Could see the way the porch light made the snow sparkle around it. For a while, nothing happened. Then the motion light on the side of my house flicked on. That light points at my driveway. In its glow, I saw something I hadn't seen from the front window, a second line of disturbed snow, shallow and smeared, running along the side of my yard near the fence where the shadows are deepest. It wasn't a clean set of prints. It looked like someone had moved low and careful, staying where the porch light doesn't reach. That second line didn't go toward the snowman. It went toward my side gate. The gate I'd locked before bed. My stomach dropped in a new way because the snowman wasn't the problem. The snowman was the theater. The footprints were the spotlight aimed at the wrong actor. I left Frank on speaker and moved quietly to the hallway that leads toward the side door. I didn't turn on lights. I didn't want to announce myself. I listened. The house was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator hum. Then I heard it. A faint metallic tick from the direction of the side gate, like something tapping metal softly. Not a loud rattle, not brute force. Careful. Testing. Waiting. I backed away and locked the interior door that separates the laundry room from the rest of the house. It felt pathetic, like putting a bookmark in a book you don't want to read, but it was something. Outside, the snowman didn't move. That was the point. Stillness can be louder than action because stillness means time, and time means planning. Sirens arrived a few minutes later, muffled by falling snow. Red and blue light washed across my front yard and turned the snowman's shadow into something tall and thin. An officer knocked, announced himself, and I let them in with my hands raised, like I was the suspect, because that's how fear makes you behave. I told them about the footprints. I told them about the snowman. I told them about the smear line by the fence. They didn't laugh. That was its own kind of relief. 2 officers went around back, while one stayed with me by the front window, watching the snowman like it might suddenly sprint. The officer beside me said low, "We see stuff like this in storms," and I didn't like the calmness in his voice. Outside, another officer approached the snowman with a flashlight and a long tool, keeping distance. He prodded the snowman's side once. The shell held for a second, then collapsed inward with a wet slump. Snow fell away in heavy slabs. There wasn't a person inside. There was a hollow cavity and a crude frame, like someone had built it around empty space on purpose. The officer frowned and crouched to examine the base. "This wasn't built by kids," he said. "Too deliberate." He lifted the scarf and found a small object tucked into the snow where a neck would be a disposable phone sealed in a plastic bag. It screamed dark. Another officer found the side gate partly unlatched. Not forced, just not fully closed, and beside it a set of fresh boot prints that looped away toward the alley behind our houses, the kind of path someone takes when they don't want to be, seen from the street. The officer by my window turned to me and said, "The footprints to the snowman were to make you look front. Whoever did this wanted you staring at that thing while they checked access somewhere else." He didn't say exactly where. He didn't have to. My own mind supplied the list. Side door, basement, window, garage. Places you don't watch when you're hypnotized by a snowman in the yard. The next morning, after the police report and the extra locks and the stupid adrenaline crash, I went outside in daylight and walked the yard. The approach prints to the snowman were still there, softened now, but visible. The area behind the snowman was still oddly smooth. I stared at that smoothness like it was a lie. Then I noticed something that made my skin go cold all over again. The first set of footprints had a slight drag at the toe, a subtle mark that suggested the person who made them might have been walking backward, pressing the heels down in a way that mimicked forward travel. I couldn't prove it, but I didn't need to. The message had been delivered. The snowman had been a sign, a prop, designed to make my attention behave predictably. It worked. Even with police in my house, I kept glancing out at my yard, expecting the snowman to be standing there again, because once your brain has been taught that something harmless can be a distraction for something human, you don't look at snow the same way. You don't look at footprints the same way. You start seeing the negative space as the real evidence. The part that's missing. The part that says someone was here long enough to plan how you would watch, and they left without letting the snow tell you how. The clown doll was under my bed because I put it there. and that was what scared me most, because I had no memory of doing it. I'm not the kind of person who collects creepy dolls. I don't even like them. But my sister shipped me a box of childhood stuff after our mum downsized, and in the box was this old clown doll. I barely remembered soft body, porcelain face, painted smile with tiny cracks at the corners, bright yarn hair that always looked dusty, no matter how clean it was. The note in the box said, "Do you remember, mister?" Giggles in that tone older siblings use when they want you to participate in nostalgia. I should have thrown it away immediately. Instead, I set it on a shelf in the guest room closet with the rest of the junk because I didn't want to deal with it. The storm hit that same night. Heavy snow and wind that made the house pop and groan like it was adjusting its bones. My wife Tessa was out with friends, and I was alone in a house full of boxes, which is the perfect recipe for your brain to start turning shadows into stories. Around 1, 2, 3, 0, I heard a faint thump from upstairs. I paused the TV and listened. Nothing. 10 minutes later, another thump followed by a light scrape like fabric against carpet. I told myself it was the house settling because that's what adults tell themselves to avoid sounding like children. I went upstairs anyway because curiosity is just fear, pretending it wants answers. The guest room was dark, the door half open. I flicked the light on and saw the closet door slightly ajar. I knew I had shut it because I'm particular about doors being closed. I walked over and opened it wider, and the shelf where I'd placed the clown doll was empty. My stomach tightened, but my first thought was still stupidly rational. Maybe it fell. I checked the closet floor. Nothing. I checked behind hanging coats. Nothing. I stepped back, scanning the room, and that's when I noticed something that should have been too ridiculous to trigger fear. A line in the carpet. A faint track, like something soft had been dragged from the closet toward the bed. I crouched and touched it. The fibers were pressed down in one direction, fresh. I felt my skin prickle. I stood up slowly and looked at the bed. The bed skirt hung straight, hiding the space underneath like a curtain. I didn't kneel down. I didn't lift it. I backed out of the room and shut the door as if that could reset reality. Downstairs I tried to distract myself, but my attention kept drifting back to the upstairs hallway, waiting for another thump. At 1:47, my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the indoor camera I'd set up in the foyer, months earlier after a package theft scare. I opened the clip expecting nothing. The video showed my foyer in night mode, grainy and grey. At the top of the stairs, a small, pale shape was visible on the landing, not moving. My pulse spiked. I zoomed in until the pixels broke apart, and the shape resolved into the clown doll's face tilted slightly, so its painted smile caught the ambient light. It was sitting at the edge of the top step, like it had been placed there to be found. The clip ended before anything moved. I stared at my screen so long my eyes watered because I couldn't make the image feel safe. Dolls don't walk downstairs, but people carry dolls. People place dolls, and the placement is the message. I texted Tessa and told her to come home. She asked why. I typed, "Just come home," and hated how desperate it looked. Then I called her, and when she heard my voice, she stopped asking questions and said she was on her way. I didn't go upstairs. I stayed in the living room, with every light on, pretending light is a barrier. At 2:12, I heard a soft sound above me, one step on carpet, slow, careful, and then another, like someone testing whether I would react. My throat went dry. I held my breath and listened. Nothing else. My mind tried to invent excuses, pipes, wind, old house. But the camera clip had already poisoned those excuses. I opened the camera live feed and watched the top of the stairs. The clown doll was no longer sitting there. The landing was empty. The hallway was dark. My chest tightened because I understood what that meant. Whatever moved it out of the camera's view, on purpose. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. When the dispatcher answered, I kept my voice low, like volume could attract attention. "I think someone is inside my house," I said. "They moved something upstairs and I'm alone." She asked if I could get outside safely. I looked at the front door and imagined turning my back to the staircase. I imagined a hand reaching from the dark, and I said, "I don't know." The dispatcher told me to stay in a locked room if possible. I backed into the living room and locked the door that leads to the hallway, then realized how meaningless interior locks are when the walls between rooms are just drywall and truss. I sat on the couch with a kitchen knife I didn't know how to use and stared at the staircase. The house was silent for a long time. Then I heard a faint squeak against wood very close, like something shifting weight on the steps. My eyes burned from not blinking. A small shape appeared at the top of the stairs, the clown doll's face peeking over the railing as if it were shy. It stayed there perfectly still. I felt my stomach twist because it looked like a child's prank, the kind that wants you to laugh before it wants you to look closer. The doll's head rose another inch slow, and then I saw it behind the doll, a sliver of shadow that didn't match the hallway's darkness. A human silhouette pressed flat to the wall, moving in increments so small you could miss them if you looked at the wrong detail. The doll wasn't moving on its own. The doll was being used as a shield, something to carry in front, like a mask for intention. My doorbell camera pinged again, another motion alert, and in that moment, the upstairs light flicked on by itself. Just the hallway light, not the guest room. Like someone wanted the stairs lit enough for me to see the doll clearly. The silhouette behind it didn't step into full view. It stayed half hidden, letting my brain do the work of fear. The dispatcher asked me what I saw. I whispered, "There's someone up there," and my voice cracked. The doll slid forward one stair, then another placed carefully, like it was being set down in positions rather than walking. The painted smile came closer. The cracked lines at the mouth looked like real wrinkles in the camera's grain. I backed away from the living room door until my shoulders hit the wall. My phone vibrated with a text from Tessa. 2 minutes. I didn't reply because my hands were numb. The figure behind the doll shifted, and I saw the edge of a pale mask, cheap plastic blank expression tilt, as if it were listening to the house. Then from upstairs a voice came down softly, almost conversational. "It's just a toy." That's what broke me, because it wasn't shouted. It wasn't frantic. It was said like reassurance, like something you'd tell a child to make them open the door. I didn't answer. I stared at the doll and the shadow behind it, and waited for the sound of sirens. When police lights finally washed, the windows blue and red, the silhouette moved fast for the first time, retreating from the stairs into the darkness of the guest hallway. Officers entered, swept the rooms, and found. The guest room window cracked open behind a curtain. The screen popped loose, snow piled on the sill like someone had climbed in and out. They found the clown doll under my bed, placed neatly, with its face turned outward, so its painted eyes would be the first thing I saw if I looked down. They found shallow wet marks on the carpet leading from the guest room toward the stairs, and then stopping as if the person had paused to listen to decide whether to keep performing. They didn't find the intruder. That was the part that kept my skin crawling after the adrenaline wore off, because a completed scare at least has an ending. This didn't. The next day, Tessa tried to make it logical. They wanted to steal, she said. They got spooked and left. Maybe. But theft doesn't require theater. Theft doesn't require a doll placed at the top of the stairs like a calling card. That was something else, a test of attention, a rehearsal of control, a way to make me feel like the house could rearrange itself while I stood in it. We threw the doll away. We replaced locks. We installed more cameras. None of that fixed the basic damage. Now every time I make the bed, I check under it without thinking, not because I expect to find a clown, but because I learned how easily an object can become a prop in someone else's plan, and how terrifying it is to realize the thing you're afraid of isn't the doll moving on its own. It's a person moving it patiently while you argue with yourself about whether you're allowed to be afraid. The eyes in the painting moved the first time I shut the curtains, and if I'd been alone I might have blamed stormlight on varnish. But my wife saw it too, and went quiet in the same second, like we'd both heard a word we weren't supposed to. Repeat. We were renting a small farmhouse for a snowy week away, the kind of place that feels cozy in photos and a little too isolated in real life. One long hallway, creaking floors, old radiators that click like someone tapping a nail against metal. The portrait hung in that hallway has stern father, a mother with a tight smile, and a little boy in a wool coat. It wasn't the adults that bothered me. It was the boy because his gaze had that uncanny, almost alive precision, like the painter had captured a child mid-thought. The first night, as the snow started to thicken outside, I noticed the boy seemed to be looking slightly past me when I walked toward the kitchen, then slightly toward me when I walked back. I did the normal thing and tried to laugh at myself because saying the eyes follow you makes you sound like you're auditioning for a ghost tour. But my wife kept glancing at it too quick. Looks like she didn't want to be caught staring. After dinner we pulled the curtains tight because the windows turned into black mirrors and the yard beyond them disappeared into drifting white. I crossed the hallway, glanced at the portrait, and my stomach tightened. The father's head looked angled, a fraction more toward our bedroom door than it had earlier, like the line of his jaw had shifted. My wife came up behind me and whispered, "Is it different?" That's when I did the rational thing people do when they don't want to feel irrational. I made a test. I tore a small strip of painter's tape from a roll in our luggage and stuck it across the bottom corner of the frame, so half the tape touched the frame and half touched the wall. If the portrait moved, the tape would tear or misalign. We went to bed pretending the tape was a joke. At doi pais prazecher. A floorboard in the hallway creaked once, slow and controlled. Not the sharp pop of settling wood, but the sound of weight, shifting and stopping. I lay still and listened for the second creak that would confirm footsteps. "Nothing," my wife whispered. "Did you hear that?" And I nodded without making a sound. I opened my phone, set the brightness low, and pulled up the hallway camera view on the rental's smart display. Grainy, slightly delayed, but enough to see the portrait hanging in its usual place. For a minute I watched and saw nothing change. Then the display flickered, one ugly stutter like a blink, and when the image stabilized, the portrait looked closer. Not physically closer, but different in a way my body registered before my brain could argue. The boy's eyes weren't just glossy. They had a pinpoint highlight that stayed fixed even when the camera's exposure shifted. Varnish, highlights, move. Lens highlights don't. I got up, quietly, stepped into the hallway, barefoot, and the air hit me with that cold, dry smell of old house and insulation. I stopped beneath the portrait and stared up at the boy's face. The eyes felt too exact, too present, like they were waiting for me to confirm the fear so it could become real. I reached to the painter's tape. It was still there, but the edges no longer lined up cleanly. The tape had wrinkled slightly, as if the frame had shifted under it, and then been pressed back into place. My throat went dry. I backed up and without meaning to changed my angle, left then right, watching the boy's pupils. The highlight didn't slide. It stayed dead center, like a tiny, patient star. Then I heard it, a soft, dry click from behind the wall, the kind of sound a latch makes when it's eased, not snapped. The portrait moved a fraction in my hands easier than it should have, as if it wasn't mounted flat at all. It was hinged. My wife whispered from the bedroom doorway, "Don't touch it." But the damage was done because the frame lifted at the bottom and swung outward just enough for cold air to spill from the gap like breath from a hidden room. And in that gap behind the boy's painted eye, I saw darkness shaped like a narrow corridor. Not a void. A space. A place. I stepped back so hard my heel bumped the baseboard. The portrait swung back into place by itself, with a gentle settle, like someone on the other side had guided it closed. My wife grabbed my arm and pulled me into the bedroom. We locked the door and called 911, whispering our address, like volume, could travel through drywall. The dispatcher told us to stay put. While we waited, the house returned to quiet so completely it felt staged. Then from the hallway, another small sound, a faint scrape, like fabric brushing plaster. The radiator clicked. The wind hissed. And then so close, it made my stomach drop. A soft voice came through the wall, not loud enough to carry naturally, but clear enough to be intentional. "You saw me." I didn't answer. I sat on the bed holding my phone like it was a weapon, staring at the door as if it could decide to be safe by force of will. Minutes later, headlights washed the curtains in blue and red. Officers came in and swept the rooms first, then the attic, then the basement. One officer stopped at the hallway portrait immediately and touched the frame like he'd seen this kind of thing before. He tugged gently, felt the give, and swung it outward on a concealed hinge. Behind it was a narrow service chase between walls, just wide enough for a person to stand sideways, lined with insulation that had been pressed flat in a path. Halfway down that hidden space was a sleeping bag, a small battery pack, and a cheap phone mounted at eye level. The camera pointed through a pinhole, aligned with the boy's painted pupil. The moving eyes weren't supernatural. They were engineered. Someone had replaced part of the canvas backing, fitted a tiny lens, and used the portrait as a door and a disguise at the same time, something you'd look at and dismiss while a living person watched you from inches away. They found him at the far end of the chase, wedged behind a stud bay, face flushed from cold and effort, holding his breath like stillness could erase him. When they let him out, he wouldn't look at us. He stared at the portrait, as if it mattered more than the people it had been used to violate. We left before dawn, snow still falling, tires crunching slow on unplowed roads, both of us silent because there are some fears you can't talk down once you've seen the mechanism behind them. Weeks later, back home, I still catch myself staring too long at framed photos, portraits, even glossy prints in hotel hallways, waiting for a highlight that doesn't move, waiting for the tiny patient proof that an object is doing its job, keeping you looking at the picture while someone real hides behind it. The mascot wouldn't speak, and at first that felt like a customer service problem, the kind you complain about and forget, until I realized the silence was the point, and the costume was a permission slip to stand anywhere without being questioned. It was mid-December, a wet snowstorm outside, and the mall was packed with families circling the Winter Village display. Fake pine trees, a North Pole photo booth, and a rotating cast of holiday characters meant to keep kids smiling while parents shopped. I was working seasonal security, mostly crowd flow and lost kid calls. The Snowman mascot was supposed to be friendly and loud. Big waves, exaggerated nods. A handler nearby, a voice that carried through the foam head. Instead, I saw a snowman standing alone at the edge of the line, perfectly still, head tilted like it was listening. Kids ran up and hugged the belly. The snowman patted one kid once, slowly, then went still again. No handler. No chatter. I stepped closer and said, "Hey, where's your escort?" The snowman turned his head toward me. Through the black mesh eye holes, I couldn't tell where the person inside was looking, and that uncertainty did something unpleasant to my stomach. I repeated myself. The snowman raised one mitten and pointed vaguely toward the staff corridor, like a silent direction to stop asking questions. I told myself, maybe the performer had a sore throat. Maybe the speaker system was down. But my body didn't buy it, because the stillness wasn't tired. It was controlled. 10 minutes later, a mother grabbed my sleeve near the escalator, frantic, saying her daughter had wandered off, near the Winter Village. Standard procedure. Lockdown. Nearby. Exits. Radio. Other guards. Sweep restrooms. Check the little blind zones behind kiosks. I asked what the girl was wearing, and before she could answer, her face tightened, and she stared over my shoulder. "That snowman," she whispered. I turned and saw the silent snowman again, now standing at the mouth of the side corridor that leads to staff-only doors, motionless facing the crowd like a marker. The corridor is where kids disappear if you blink. Restrooms, deliveries, stairwells. I moved fast, and as I closed distance, the snowman drifted backward a step, without turning like it was pulling away while keeping the front-facing illusion. I spotted the little girl near a candy kiosk, crying but safe, and walked her back to her mother. Then I got on the radio and called the Winter Village coordinator. "Who's in the snowman suit right now?" I asked. She sounded annoyed, then confused. "The snowman's on break," she said. "Suits locked in storage. We only have one." My mouth went dry. I scanned the floor again. I didn't see him, which made it worse, because it meant he could stand out in the open and still vanish the moment you looked away. I told her to meet me in the back, and we went into the service corridor that smells like cardboard and mop water. Storage was a cluttered room, with spare ornaments and folding stanchions. In the corner hung the official snowman suit on a rack head, resting on top like a decapitated prop, and the coordinator's face drained because the suit was clearly untouched, clean dry tag, still clipped to the zipper, she whispered. "Then who is that out there?" We pulled camera footage. and the answer arrived in the worst possible way. Not a dramatic chase, not a single obvious crime, but a pattern of the silent snowman appearing at the edges of frames, always. In places where people relaxed their caution near restroom, entrances beside mirrored columns, behind teenagers on their phones close enough to be presents, without being threat. People glanced registered holiday character and looked away. In one clip he stood behind a woman in line, close enough that his shadow covered her shoes. She laughed awkwardly, assuming it was playful, and shifted forward. He shifted forward too, matching her distance, never touching, never speaking, using the costume like a right to occupy her personal space, without consequence. That's when a guard radioed that he'd seen the snowman in the parking garage near the elevators. My stomach tightened, because the garage is where cameras blur and sound echoes, and people are alone. I went with 2 officers as they arrived. We swept the levels. The snowman didn't run like a normal person would. He did something smarter. He went still behind a row of SUVs where the camera angle made him look like a snow-dusted tarp. A flashlight passed over him once and moved on. Then the beam came back slower and the officer said, "That's a person," like he was angry at the idea. The snowman finally moved quick, low, decisive, trying to slip toward the stairwell. Officers caught him at the landing, and when they hauled him out of the costume, the first thing that hit me was how ordinary he looked without it, which is the whole point of a costume in a crowd. They found a mall map, folded in his pocket, with staff corridors circled, and a list of times written like a schedule, when the Winter Village line was longest, when security rotations shifted, when the garage was quiet. He still hadn't spoken. Even in cuffs, he kept his mouth shut, eyes flat, like silence was part of the disguise. I thought that would be the end of it, an ugly story that stays at the mall. Then I got home. The snowstorm had intensified, covering my street in clean white that makes everything look peaceful from a distance. My wife had left the porch light on. As I walked up the steps, my phone buzzed, motion alert from our door camera. I opened the live feed and stopped breathing. At the edge of our porch, light half in shadow, stood a snowman mascot, same red scarf, same foam body facing our front door as if it belonged there. My wife answered my call in a whisper and said I thought it was you because of course she did. Of course, a snowman on the porch reads as harmless. I told her to lock the bedroom door and call 911. I stayed on the sidewalk and watched the feed while my heart hammered because I had learned the rule the mall had taught me. The moment you step closer is the moment you stop being a watcher and become part of the scene. Sirens approached and the snowman did the most unsettling thing of all. He didn't panic. He simply went, still perfectly decorative, angled, so a neighbor glancing out would see Holiday and dismiss it. Then when cruiser lights washed the street, he moved fast and tried to cut along the side yard. Officers caught him at the fence. Under the foam head was a thin face covering that flattened expression into nothing, and in the costume pocket was a crumpled scrap of paper with my name on it, the name on my uniform badge, the one strangers can read while you're doing your yob. Later, an officer said quietly, "Names travel," and I understood why the mascot never spoke. A voice gives you a person. Silence lets the costume stay an object, and objects are allowed to linger. For weeks after, my wife jumped at every knock. The mall pulled the roaming mascots and required handlers and visible IDs as if policy could undo the lesson. But policy doesn't fix what that snowman taught my nervous system, that the most dangerous disguise isn't a mask that looks scary. It's a shape that looks normal enough that everyone agrees not to question it, especially when it's standing right where it shouldn't be, waiting for you to treat it like part of the decor. I almost stepped on the pile of clothes because the snow had covered it so neatly that my brain filed it under harmless trash and moved on, and that's exactly what nearly got me killed. The storm had been dumping all day, the kind of thick, steady snowfall that makes the world quiet and soft and stupidly beautiful, and by evening my driveway looked like a blank white ramp leading to my garage. I'd been out twice already, shoveling, trying to stay ahead of it, and by the third time I was moving on autopilot. Head down, breath loud inside my scarf, the metal shovel scraping concrete in a rhythm that made me feel like I was doing something useful. I noticed the dark lump near the side of my driveway, only because it didn't match the clean white around it. It sat by the hedge, half buried like someone had tossed a jacket, and it had vanished under powder. I remember thinking annoyed, great, now the wind is throwing my trash cans around again. I walked over without slowing because you don't respect a pile of laundry in your own yard. The closer I got, the more it looked like clothing, a sleeve shape, a hood shape, a fold, like denim. It was dark, soaked at the edges, and the snow on top had smoothed it into something that resembled a person curled up. But my mind refused to name that. Naming it would force me to act. I nudged it with my boot to flip it, so I could grab it with the shovel. The pile resisted. Not like fabric snagging, like weight. My boot hit something firm under the snow and the lump shifted as a whole. A slow roll as if whatever was beneath was trying to keep the top layer intact. My throat tightened. I stood still and listened, because your body knows things before your thoughts do. The storm hissed. The neighbor's wind chimes gave a distant click. Then from inside the pile, a faint sound like a wet inhale. Breath. Controlled, quiet, practiced breath. I didn't move. I stared at the dark folds and tried to force my eyes to see it as cloth again, because cloth is manageable. Cloth doesn't breathe. The pile exhaled. The snow on top lifted a fraction and settled back down, and in that movement I saw the trick. A thin sheet of plastic under the snow, stretched like a skin, holding the powder in place so the shape stayed smooth and natural, hiding any obvious disturbances. A decoy blanket of snow laid carefully, so my brain would see a lump and dismiss it. I took one step backwards, slow, trying not to trigger whatever was waiting under there. My boot scraped the driveway. The pile reacted instantly. A gloved hand burst out from the side like an animal coming out of a burrow, fingers splayed, grabbing for my ankle. The glove was dark and wet, and the hand moved with sudden speed that didn't match the slow breathing. I jerked back and yanked free, stumbling hard enough that I dropped the shovel. The hand vanished back under the snow, pulling the plastic sheet with it to restore the illusion. For 1 sick second, the lump looked like a pile of clothes again, as if my brain had hallucinated the hand. Then the lump shifted closer, not rolling, sliding the way a person moves when they're on their stomach, using elbows and knees under a cover. Still no clear tracks, because the plastic sheet and the fresh powder were doing their job, smoothing the evidence as he advanced. I ran for the garage door and punched the keypad with numb fingers. The door groaned up slowly, too slow, and I could hear the faint scrape of something moving behind me, low and fast. I dove inside and slammed the button for the door to close, heart hammering so hard my vision tunneled. As the door descended, the outside world narrowed to a strip. In that strip, I saw the pile of clothes unfold into a person. Dark winter gear, a hood, a face mask, one hand still under the plastic sheet and the other holding something thin and metallic that flashed once in the porch light. A knife. A tool. Either way, not something you bring to help. The garage door hit the ground with a thud and I locked the interior door to the house, backing away like the walls could be trusted. My hands shook so badly, I fumbled my phone twice before I dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, I tried to speak normally and failed. "There's someone outside," I said. They were buried in the snow. They pretended to be clothes. The dispatcher didn't ask me to repeat it. That terrified me more than skepticism would have. "Stay inside. Do not go back out. Officers are en route," she said, and I realized this wasn't an imaginative fear. This was a pattern someone had used before. Through the garage side window, I could still see the lump by the hedge. It had returned to its pile shape, smoothed again, as if the person had slid back into position under the plastic. The storm kept falling, doing the intruder the favor of erasing the frantic scuffs from my stumble. I forced myself to stay away from windows, like the dispatcher said, but I couldn't stop watching. The pile didn't move for several minutes, and I hated how quickly my mind started trying to reinterpret it as harmless again. Maybe it was a homeless guy freezing. Maybe he needed help. Maybe I should. That's the trap. The storm makes you want to be compassionate, and predators know it. My phone buzzed with a motion alert from my driveway camera, and the clip showed what my eyes couldn't catch in real time. The pile wasn't just near the hedge. It was positioned exactly in the blind spot between the camera's view and the garage corner, where a person could wait without being captured clearly, and the moment I approached the hand, reached out in a straight line toward the only part. of my body that would be closest. My ankle, because ankles are easy, low, fast, quiet. In the live feed, I watched the pile shift an inch at a time toward the side door that leads into my mudroom. He wasn't trying the garage door. He was moving toward the door people forget to lock because they think the garage is a buffer. My stomach dropped because I remembered with a cold clarity that I had used that door earlier to bring groceries in, and I couldn't remember if I had turned the deadbolt or just pulled it closed. I crept to the mudroom door and checked it, hands sweating, and the deadbolt was not engaged. Just the knob lock. My chest tightened into a hard knot. Outside, the pile stopped moving for a moment as if he could hear me and was waiting for the moment my attention shifted to the lock. I threw the deadbolt and backed away. The scrape resumed. Then there was a soft tap on the mudroom door. Not loud, not violent. A test. Another tap slightly higher. A pause. Then a thin metallic click, like a tool touching the lock. My breathing got shallow. The storm outside was loud enough to cover tiny sounds, and that meant he could work without fear of neighbors hearing. I stayed on the phone with the dispatcher whispering updates, while the taps and clicks continued in patient cycles, as if the person on the other side had all night. Then just as cruiser lights finally washed the snow in red and blue, the clicking stopped. In the camera feed, the pile of clothes went completely still again. The intruder flattened under the plastic sheet so perfectly that for a second even I could have believed it was just trash in snow. Officers approached with flashlights and a long-handled rake. One prodded the pile from a distance. The plastic shifted, and the snow on top slid off in a clean sheet, exposing the dark gear underneath. The person sprang up and tried to sprint, but the moment he stood, the illusion broke and the snow betrayed him. Deep footprints, loud crunches, the clumsy honesty of a human body moving upright. Officers tackled him hard near the hedge, and the plastic sheet tore, flapping like a discarded skin. When they cuffed him, his hands were raw and red, his breathing ragged now that he couldn't control it. One officer pulled the thin metal object from his pocket, not just a knife, but a slim pry tool wrapped in tape to keep it quiet. Another found a roll of clear plastic sheeting, a small folding shovel, and a pair of thin gloves meant for lock work, plus a hand warmer still, hot taped to the inside of his jacket like he'd planned to lie buried for hours. He was waiting, the officer said, disgusted, looking at the smoothness of the snow where the plastic had been, waiting for you to do exactly what you did. After they took him away, the storm kept falling, already trying to erase the scene. The torn plastic sheet looked like nothing in the dim light, just a clear ripple on white. But my brain couldn't unsee what it had been, a tool to turn a person into an object, to make my eyes label him harmless until the moment his hand could reach me. The next morning in daylight, you could barely tell where it happened. Fresh snow had covered the scuffs. The hedge wore a clean white cap. Only the faint impression of the plastic's outline remained, a subtle, smooth patch that looked to anyone else like nothing at all. I stood there with my coffee going cold and realized the most terrifying part wasn't the hand reaching from the snow. It was how close I came to kneeling down, to grabbing the clothes, to doing the helpful human thing, because my brain had been trained to trust the shape of something ordinary. In a storm, ordinary shapes are the easiest place to hide because you don't just overlook them. You protect them. You explain them away. You step close. The shadow detached from the tree, like it had decided it didn't need the trunk anymore, and I watched it happen through my living room window, while the storm turned the street into a dim, wind-blown tunnel. It started as a normal winter annoyance. My porch light kept triggering, even though nobody was outside, and every time it turned on, it painted the front yard in a harsh yellow cone that made every branch look like a reaching hand. I'd just moved into the house, and the motion sensor was oversensitive, catching drifting snow, swaying shrubs, whatever the wind wanted to throw at it. Around 1150 p.m. The light snapped on again, and I sighed, annoyed because the on-off cycle was starting to feel like a metronome for insomnia. I pushed the curtain aside to make sure no deer were in the yard, and that's when I noticed the shadow. It was at the base of the big oak, near the sidewalk. A dark smear against white snow, perfectly aligned with the trunk, as if it belonged there. At first, it looked like the tree's own shadow cast long by the porch light. That's what shadows do. They attach to things. They follow rules. I stared for a few seconds and almost let it go, because my brain loves rules. Then the porch light flickered just a tiny dip in brightness, and when it stabilized, the shadow at the base of the oak shifted sideways by a few inches while the trunk stayed exactly where it was. Not much. Just enough to break the rule. I blinked hard and leaned closer to the glass. The oak's branches were still. The wind was moving the smaller bushes, not the oak. The shadow should have been steady, but the dark shape had changed its outline thicker, now at one edge like a shoulder. I told myself it was snow drifting across the shadow line, warping it. Then the shadow moved again. It slid away from the trunk in a smooth, low motion, as if it were peeling off the tree, and for a second my brain couldn't categorize what I was seeing. Not an animal, not a person standing upright, not a branch. It was a shape staying low to the ground, using darkness, the way a body uses cover. The porch light didn't capture details, only contrast, and in that contrast the shape looked exactly like a shadow that had decided to become independent. My mouth went dry. I backed away from the window and grabbed my phone because I needed a second set of eyes, even if it was a lens. Through the camera the yard flattened into grainy black and white, and the shape by the oak became even less human, more abstract, which somehow made it worse. It slid along the snow toward the side of my house, hugging the edge where the porch light couldn't reach. I realized with a cold clarity that the shadow wasn't supernatural. It was tactical. Whoever it was had chosen the oak, because the trunk and the real shadow gave them an anchor point, a place your eyes accept as normal darkness. Stand still there, and you become part of the background. Move only when the light flickers, or when the wind throws snow across the sensor and makes brightness change, and you can shift position without the casual observer noticing. I watched the shape reach the corner of my house and disappear into the blind strip beside the garage. The porch light clicked off. My stomach dropped because now I had lost the only illumination that gave me the illusion of control. 10 seconds later the light clicked back on, and in its cone something new appeared that hadn't been there before. A second shadow at the oak, perfectly placed, perfectly attached to the trunk again. For a moment I stared confused, because if the shadow had left, how could it be back? Then I understood the second layer of the trick. The shadow at the oak wasn't a shadow at all. It was a decoy, a cutout, a sheet of dark fabric or plastic pinned to the snow shaped like a person, crouched positioned so the porch light would cast it as a believable smear at the trunk. It was theater meant to hold my gaze at the oak, while the real person moved along the house. My skin went cold all over. I pulled up my exterior cameras. The front door cam showed the yard, but not the garage corner. The side camera showed the driveway, and part of the side yard. In the side feed I saw the real shadow, now a person in dark winter gear pressed flat against my siding, moving in inches, pausing whenever the sensor light brightened, then advancing when it dimmed, synchronizing their movement with the light, to cycle like they'd practiced. They weren't walking. They were sliding their body along the wall, keeping profile small, making themselves a line rather than a silhouette. In one frame, the porch light flared brighter, and their face turned slightly toward the camera, and I saw the pale oval of something featureless, either a cheap mask or frost on fabric erasing expression, so the head looked like a blank spot. In the dark, my heart hammered so hard it made my hands shake. I didn't go to the door. I didn't yell. I called 911 and whispered my address because sound felt like it would tell them exactly where I was standing inside. The dispatcher told me to stay away from windows and doors. I obeyed, mostly. I backed into my hallway and watched the camera feed from a safer angle. The shadow reached the side gate latch and paused. A gloved hand lifted and the metal latch moved, without noise eased, not forced. They had done this before. Then the porch light clicked off again. In the side camera's night vision, the person became a darker patch against dark siding. The only thing that gave them away was the way the snow under their knees compressed in slow pulses as they shifted weight. They slipped through the side gate, stayed low, and approached the small basement window well, the one half hidden behind shrubs. I felt nausea rise, because basement windows are the kind of weakness you forget exists until someone else treats it like a door. The shadow paused and reached into a pocket. Something thin flashed metal, then disappeared. A tool touched the window frame with the smallest click. I whispered updates to the dispatcher until my voice started to shake. She said officers were close. I watched the person stop moving every time my porch light triggered again, as if the light itself was a signal. Each time the light came on, the decoy shadow at the oak held steady, still doing its job, still giving the neighborhood's casual glance something normal to land on. It was brilliant in the ugliest way, a 2-point performance. One shadow to keep eyes busy, one shadow to do the work. Then police lights washed the street in blue and red, and the entire yard changed color. The porch sensor light didn't matter anymore. The decoy at the oak became obvious, immediately flat, unnatural, a sheet pinned to snow. The real person reacted the second the cruiser lights hit the side yard. They rose into a crouch and tried to sprint, and the moment they stood, they became honest. A human body, loud footsteps, deep prints, a silhouette that couldn't pretend to be a shadow anymore. Officers cut them off at the side gate. The person tried to drop back down, tried to become darkness again, but the flashlights found them easily now because bright directed light kills the trick. They cuffed him in my driveway, while snow swirled around his legs, and when they pulled his hood back, his hair was damp with sweat, cheeks raw with cold ice, flat with the kind of patience that scares you more than anger. In his pocket, they found a folded piece of dark fabric, cut into a crude human outline, stiffened with tape so it would hold shape, plus 2 stakes for pinning it into snow at the oak. They also found a small roll of reflective tape and a cheap remote that could trigger motion sensors, letting him control when lights turned on and off, letting him choreograph shadows the way a director choreographs actors. The officer showed me the decoy piece and said, "He wanted you looking at the tree." He said it like he was angry at the idea of my attention being used as a weapon. After they took the intruder away, I stood at the window and stared at the oak. In the harsh light of street lamps, it was just a tree, just bark and snow and branches. But my brain refused to let it go back to being just. The next day, the snow fell lighter, and the yard looked normal again, clean and quiet, like nothing had happened. But every time my porch light triggers now, I don't just glance to see what's there. I search for what should be attached, and isn't. I look for the piece of darkness that doesn't behave like darkness. Because once you've watched a person turn themselves into a shadow on purpose, you stop trusting the simplest rule of night, that the dark is empty. The snowman smiled at me with human teeth, and my brain tried to reject what my eyes were insisting on because teeth are not something you accidentally put on a snowman. It was just after midnight, the kind of winter night where the streetlights look bruised through falling snow and the neighborhood goes so quiet you can hear your own furnace kick on like a warning. I'd been up late because the storm kept triggering my porch light, and every time it snapped on, it made the world outside my window feel staged, like a set built for someone else's scene. I finally pulled the curtain aside and saw the snowman standing at the edge of my walkway, facing my front door. I hadn't built a snowman. Nobody in my house had built a snowman. The yard was a smooth sheet of white, with no obvious footprints, and the snowman looked too clean, too freshly packed like it had been assembled fast and then polished by hands that didn't want to leave a mess. It wore a scarf I didn't recognize. Its stick arms were set at a slight angle that felt like posture, not decoration, and even from inside, something about its face made my skin prickle. I leaned closer to the glass, squinting against the glare of the porch light on snow, and that's when I saw the mouth. It wasn't pebbles. It wasn't a carved smile. It was a row of teeth, real-looking teeth, set into the snow as if the snowman had a jaw, not cartoon teeth, not painted, wet, reflective enamel catching the light. My stomach dropped so hard I felt it in my legs. I told myself it had to be a prank, some kind of novelty gag, a plastic Halloween prop jammed into winter, but the teeth looked uneven, imperfect in the way real teeth are imperfect. One front tooth was slightly chipped. The gums, if you could call them that, were a dark thawed line in the snow like warmth had melted the mouth into shape. I backed away from the window and grabbed my phone, and as I did, I realized my dog wasn't barking. He was hiding behind the couch, trembling eyes fixed on the front door like it was an animal that might open itself. I live alone. No wife to wake, no roommate to blame, no kid to accuse of being stupid. Just me, my dog, and a snowman with teeth that didn't belong to it. I opened my camera app and zoomed in through the glass. The picture got grainy, but the teeth stayed sharp. That's the thing about teeth. Your brain recognizes them as a human sign. They mean mouth. They mean bite. They mean someone alive had touched that snow with the intimacy of building a face. The porch light buzzed, and for a second the snowman's shadow jumped, making it look like it had leaned forward. I flinched, and my phone slipped. When I steadied it and looked again, the snowman was in the same place, perfectly still. I tried to breathe slowly, tried to talk myself down. I told myself there was a harmless explanation, and I would find it in daylight. Then the snowman's mouth opened, not wide, just a fraction like a jaw loosening. The teeth parted enough to show darkness behind them, a hollow, and then through that hollow I saw a tiny puff of vapor bloom and vanish. Breath. Someone was breathing behind the teeth. I didn't scream. I didn't rush outside. I did, the only smart thing I've ever done in a moment like that. I stepped away from the window and called 911. My voice came out low and cracked because saying snowman felt ridiculous and saying teeth felt insane. There's someone outside my house, I told the dispatcher. They're inside a snowman. It has teeth. I saw it breathe. There was a pause, and I waited for disbelief, but the dispatcher didn't laugh. She just said, very calmly, "Stay inside. Lock your doors. Do not approach the window." As if she'd heard versions of this before. I checked my deadbolt even though I'd checked it twice already, and I pulled the chain across, like a chain means anything when someone has time. The dispatcher asked if the person was trying to get in. I looked back at the window, keeping distance, and that's when the snowman's head tilted slightly, a slow, careful motion that could not be explained by wind. The teeth flashed again. The mouth opened a little wider, and I heard it not through the phone, not through imagination, a faint scrape against my porch boards, like someone shifting weight outside. The snowman had moved closer, without leaving visible tracks, or maybe the falling snow was covering them faster than my eyes could register. Either way, the distance between my front door and that thing was shrinking. I turned off the living room light so my reflection wouldn't float on the glass like a target, and I crouched behind the wall where I could still see the front yard through a narrow angle. I watched the snowman in the porch light's cone like it was a wild animal, waiting for the moment it decided to stop pretending. Minutes dragged. My dog started whining softly, the sound small and hopeless. The snowman stayed still long enough that my mind began to whisper the dangerous thought, maybe you imagined the breath. Maybe you're overreacting. Maybe it's just a sculpture. Then the teeth clicked. A tiny sound, quick and sharp like enamel tapping enamel. The mouth closed and opened again, and the teeth shifted as if someone inside was testing the fit. I felt nausea rise because the detail was so intimate. This wasn't a random prowler. This was someone who had decided to build a face for you to look at. Then my phone buzzed with a motion alert from my doorbell camera. I opened the live feed, and my blood went cold. On the night vision view, the snowman's face looked different. The teeth were brighter, and behind them I could see movement, a darker shape inside a head, turning eyes, positioned where the coal eyes should have been watching the camera, the way a person watches a lens. The snowman lifted one stick arm. The stick wasn't a stick at all. It was a rod held by a gloved hand, and that hand raised slowly until the arm pointed at my door handle. The gesture was so deliberate, it felt like instruction. Then through the door, so faint it could have been the wind if it wasn't a voice, I heard a whisper, open up, not shouted, not pleading, calm, confident, like the person believed they had time to negotiate the boundary into disappearing. I backed away, heart pounding, and my foot bumped a chair. The sound was tiny, but in a quiet house, tiny sounds are loud. Outside, the snowman froze harder, as if it had switched back into being an object. The porch light's buzz was suddenly the loudest thing in the world. Sirens finally threaded through the storm, distant at first, then closer. And I watched the snowman react, in the only way that proved it was never a snowman at all. It moved, with speed. The head ducked. The body shifted. The snow shell cracked at the side as a person inside tried to step out of the costume and run. The first officer's headlights washed the yard and the illusion collapsed in an instant. The snowman wasn't built from clean snow. It was a hollow frame, draped with packed snow, and a white sheet shaped quickly into 3 lumps. The teeth weren't a decoration. They were a set of dentures jammed into a slit in the snow, so a mouth would look unmistakably human, even from a window. As officers shouted commands, the intruder tore free from the collapsing shell and sprinted toward the side yard, leaving deep, honest footprints, now that he wasn't trying to hide his movement. They tackled him near the hedge, and when they cuffed him, the dentures fell from the torn mouth, slit and landed in the snow with a wet little thud. One officer picked them up with 2 fingers disgusted, and I saw the underside worn plastic stained, the kind you'd find in a cheap case on a nightstand. Human teeth as costume jewelry. A message that said I can put a human mouth wherever I want, even on something you're trained to see as harmless. After they took him away, an officer asked if I recognized the scarf. I didn't. They asked if anything was missing from my house. I said no, and then I realized how foolish that question was, because theft wasn't the point. The point was that I had looked out a window and seen something childish made into something intimate and predatory, and my body had responded exactly as the person wanted. I watched. I hesitated. I tried to make it make sense. When the police lights were gone and the storm resumed erasing footprints, the yard looked normal again. Just snow and silence. But the dentures left an impression in my mind I can't scrub out. Now, when I see a smile on anything that shouldn't have one, a mannequin, a mask, a decoration, I don't think creepy. I think someone put that there. And I don't imagine a ghost. I imagine a person hiding behind a prop, breathing softly, waiting for the moment you step close enough that teeth become a weapon instead of a joke. It wasn't a snowman, and the only reason I know that for sure is because the thing outside our window blinked back at my son when he waved at it. The storm had rolled in fast that afternoon, turning our quiet cul-de-sac into a white blur, and by nightfall the snow was coming down hard enough that the world beyond our porch light looked like static. It should have been one of those cozy nights people post about hot chocolate, a movie the kids building, something silly in the yard earlier, while the snow was still soft. We had built 2 snowmen before dinner, one by the driveway and one near the big front window so the kids could see it from the couch. They gave it a crooked carrot nose, a scarf from the lost and found pile, and coal eyes that looked cute in the porch light. My daughter joked that it looked like it was guarding the house. My son, 8, and still in the age where winter feels like magic, pressed his hands to the glass and said good night to it before bed. At 9:40, my wife went upstairs to check on them, and I stayed downstairs, half watching the weather report, half listening to the wind shove at the siding. The power flickered once, came back, flickered again, and settled into that uneasy hum of a house running on the edge of a storm. That was when I noticed the snowman's face was angled differently. It had been facing the street. Now it faced the window. I told myself the base had shifted in the wind, that the snow underneath had slumped. Then I noticed how close it was to the glass. It hadn't been that close. I didn't measure it. I didn't need to. The distance felt wrong in my bones. I stood up and leaned forward, squinting, trying to find the safe explanation. The yard looked smooth, wind-brushed. The falling snow was thick enough to hide detail. Still, I expected to see some sign of movement. Drag marks, churned steps, anything. I saw nothing but clean snow and that white figure standing as if it belonged there. My wife came down with that tired parent expression and asked what I was staring at. I pointed, and she did the same thing I did. Tried to laugh first. "It's just the snowman," she said, and then her voice thinned because she saw it too. The snowman's coal eyes looked glossy, too reflective, and the mouth a simple pebble grin earlier looked darker, wider, like something had been pressed into the snow with a hand. Our dog started growling low and continuous, the kind of sound he only makes when someone is at the door. My wife whispered, "Did you hear anything outside?" I shook my head. The storm was loud enough to cover small noises, which meant the yard could be full of sound, and we'd never know. I reached for my phone to check the doorbell camera feed, and the moment I looked down, the porch light flared brighter. When I looked up again, the snowman was closer. Not inches. Feet. Close enough now that the scarf's texture wasn't just color. It was fabric layered. and the snow on the shoulders looked like it had been dusted deliberately to keep the shape clean. My wife said my name in a tone that told me not to go outside, and I didn't plan to. I planned to call someone to make it official, to make it not just our eyes. I started dialing 911, and that's when my son's bedroom light clicked on upstairs. A small voice called Dad, followed by the soft thump of feet on the stairs. My wife moved to intercept him, but he was already halfway down, sleepy and curious, rubbing his eyes. He walked into the living room and saw the snowman in the window, like it was a friend, and before either of us could stop him, he waved. "Hi," he said, like greeting the yard was normal. The snowman waved back, not with a stick arm twitching in wind. A slow, controlled lift. The stick rose with purpose. My son giggled, delighted, and then the snowman's head tilted slightly to the side and it blinked. I don't mean the coal eyes shifted. I mean lids closed and opened in a smooth, human blink. My son's giggle died in his throat. My daughter appeared at the top of the stairs and froze. The dog's growl sharpened into barking. My wife grabbed our son by the shoulders and pulled him back from the window so fast he stumbled. I heard my own voice come out harsh and loud, upstairs. Now. The word now carried enough fear that the kids obeyed without arguing. I locked the hallway door behind them like that could separate our lives into safe and unsafe parts. I went back to the window and forced myself to look. The snowman's mouth was wrong. The pebbles weren't pebbles anymore. They were teeth, or something trying to be teeth pale and reflective behind a slit. The scarf was tied too neatly, like Hans had done it with practice. And the coal eyes weren't coal. They were holes. Deep, dark, watching. My phone was still in my hand, 911 ringing dispatcher, answering, and I heard myself speak with a clarity that felt borrowed. There is a person outside my house wearing something white. They are pretending to be our snowmen. The dispatcher told us to stay away from windows, to lock doors, to get to a safe room. The problem was the house itself felt like a display case now, and every window felt like a place you could be watched from inches away. We herded the kids into the upstairs bathroom and shut the door, my wife holding them tight while I stayed on the landing, with the phone pressed to my ear, trying to see the first floor without stepping into view. Downstairs, the porch light clicked off. Not flickered. Off, like someone's hand had reached up and flipped the switch. Then it clicked back on again, and in the brief darkness between my mind filled in movement like a nightmare. A tapping started on the front window. Soft. Polita. 3 taps, a pause. Then 3 more like a knock on glass. My daughter started crying behind the bathroom door. The tapping moved along the window pane slowly, as if the person outside was walking their fingers across the glass, testing how thick it was. Then a new sound, the faint jingle of the front doorknob being tried, not yanked, tested. My wife whispered through the bathroom door, "Are they coming in?" And I didn't answer, because I didn't want my voice to make it true. The dispatcher asked if I could see the intruder. I couldn't, not without going down, not without stepping into the living room, where the window would turn me into a silhouette. The dog barked again, then yelped once sharp and sudden, and the barking stopped. That silence nearly broke me. I crept down 2 stairs, just enough to see the living room corner through the banister. The dog was standing stiff near the front door, ears pinned back, staring at the window as if it had become a predator. The snowman was no longer by the window. The yard outside looked empty, except for swirling snow. That emptiness was worse than the figure because it meant the person had moved out of our sight, and once you lose sight of them, you start imagining every corner of your house as the next place they'll appear. The doorbell camera pinged with a motion alert. I opened the live feed with shaking hands. In night vision, the porch was a grey blur. Then the image stabilized enough for me to see it. A tall figure pressed flat against the wall beside the front door, wearing white from head to toe. Not a costume shaped like a snowman now, but a smooth pale cover that made them look like part of the storm itself. The face was covered by something blank and light-catching, and the head turned slightly, as if listening to the sounds inside. The figure lifted one hand and held it up to the camera lens, blocking it gently, like shushing a witness. Then the feed went black, not disconnected. Covered. My chest tightened so hard it hurt. I told the dispatcher the camera was blocked. She said officers were on the way, but roads were bad. I could hear it in her voice. The storm was buying the person outside time. Another sound started faint at first, then clearer, a scraping along the siding near the side of the house, like someone moving to another entry point. Our house has a small mudroom door on the side that we use for boots. I couldn't remember if I deadbolted it after bringing firewood in. I moved toward it and stopped, because moving toward doors is what people do in horror movies, right before the door becomes the problem. Still, I couldn't let the uncertainty sit there. I checked the side door as quietly as I could. The deadbolt was locked. Relief hit me so hard I almost laughed, and that's when something tapped the glass of the mudroom window from the outside right beside my face. One tap, then another. Close enough that my breath fogged the inside pane, while someone else's breath fogged the outside. I froze her. Through the frosted edge of the glass I saw a blur of pale fabric, and the dark oval where a face might be inches away. A muffled voice slid through the door. Calm, intimate, awful. I can wait. My stomach dropped because waiting means patience, and patience means planning. I backed away, slowly holding my phone like a lifeline, and returned to the stairs where I could keep the kids behind me. The tapping stopped. The house went quiet again, except for the storm. Minutes passed. Then the power flickered and died completely. The lights went out. The furnace cut. The house fell into a cold, dark hush, and the only illumination came from my phone screen and the faint glow of snow reflecting streetlight outside. In that darkness, the front window became a black mirror. I could see my own pale face in it, and behind my reflection outside a white shape appeared again, centered in the glass, like it had always been there. Not a snowman. A person standing so still, my eyes wanted to label it decoration. The figure lifted its hand slowly and pressed a palm to the glass. Then with the other hand it held up something that flashed pale even in the dark, a child's mitten. My son's mitten, the blue one he'd dropped in the yard earlier. The figure squeezed it gently, like a fret delivered with softness. My wife sobbed, once, behind the bathroom door, stifled, and the figure's head tilted, as if it hurt her. Then it turned and walked away into the storm, disappearing the moment the porch light flickered back on from emergency power. Sirens arrived not long after, their sound muffled and delayed by snow, and when officers finally swept the yard, they found no snowman, no intruder, no clear trail, just disturbed patches near the fence and the collapsed remains of our original calmed snowman by the driveway, smashed, as if someone had been angry at the idea of the harmless version existing. One officer said carefully that sometimes people in storms do strange things, that maybe it was a prank, maybe a drunk, maybe someone lost. He said it in the tone of someone trying to keep a family calm. Then he held up something they'd found near the front window, a small strip of white fabric, torn and damp with faint grey smudges that looked like soot or paint, and he didn't finish his sentence because he didn't have to. We didn't sleep that night. We sat in the living room after the power returned, all the lights on, the kids wrapped in blankets, my wife holding them like she could fuse them to safety. Outside, snow kept falling, covering the yard, smooth again, erasing evidence, restoring the illusion of quiet suburbia. In the morning, the world looked normal. Clean drifts, glittering ice neighbors, shoveling kids, making fresh snowballs. The only thing that proved the night was real was my son's mitten, which was gone from our basket and never came back. Weeks later, when the snow finally melted, I found something in the mulch bed beneath the front window, a cheap white mask cracked at the edge, blank as paper. The kind of face that can look like anything you're afraid of if you stare long enough. It wasn't a snowman. It was a person wearing winter, like a costume, using the storm as cover, using our own decorations as a language. And the part I can't shake is the moment my son waved, and it waved back, because that moment wasn't about breaking in. It was about teaching us a rule we never wanted, in the right weather with the right stillness. Something alive can stand in your yard and let your brain call it harmless, and by the time you correct yourself, it has already been watching your house long enough to learn where you are.